Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome, everybody, to this side event for the 11th European Forum on the Rights of the Child on the topic of children deprived of their liberty and alternatives to detention. I'm going to start with the easy things, the housekeeping, before I forget. You are asked when you're in this building to keep your badge on, please, over the next couple of days. On the back of your the name of the app you can download on your smartphone. And on the app, if you haven't already looked, you can contact other participants. And we would encourage you to opportunity to network. There as well. Down the back of the room, we have Maria, who is doing the graphic recording. So she'll be listening very carefully to everything that is said and doing her best to capture the main messages. So make sure you're and as we would all like them. This event is web streamed. Microphone when we take the floor. When you take the floor, please remember to state your name and There is water down the back of the room. Please help yourselves, but if you do take a bottle up to your desk, I would ask you to make sure the lid is closed. The conference organisers are quite wary of people having water on the tables because there have been accidents with the microphones and water. So please just put the lids on. I'd like to thank, first of all, thank you, Ursula. A big thank you to Professor Ursula Kilkelly, who agreed to co-chair this side event, and all the speakers who are here today, and all of you participants who gave up your time and are here. It's really important. You have all seen the background paper, I hope, and I would just remind you, please take a child rights-based approach. The aim of this side event is to ensure that when you go into the forum, at least there are 170 people who are more aware of the situation of children who are deprived of their liberty and the circumstances before, during, and after. So please remember that we are sending you as envoys to the forum. Bring the knowledge with you and use it during the discussions. I would like to thank my team and tell you who they are. We are all wearing these beautiful red scarves. So Marta, can you put up your hand? Marta, many of you will have been in contact with by email. She is the chief organizer and whipcracker, and she has done most of the organizing. And Tommaso will be our photographer for the afternoon. So thank you, Tommaso. Dana, for any of you who have admired the beautiful compilations that are annexed to the general background paper, so the data, the background reading, all like 500 links, the quotes and drawings by children, the international standards. Dana worked on all of those, so thank you, Dana. Kata also works on rights of the child, and she will be at the session on children in conflict with the law. I think that's it from me, and I'd like now to hand over to Ursula, who will focus on the substance.
Okay. Thanks, Margaret. Afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon in front of such a large audience. There's so much expertise and knowledge in the room. I think it'll be a fantastic day in advance of the 11th Forum on the Rights of the Child. And just before I make some remarks about the subject, I think we need to all pay particular tribute to the other person who wasn't named in Margaret's remarks, and that's Margaret Stewart herself. She's done an incredible job, not just this year, but this is the 11th year of the Forum that has established this as the leading European event on the rights of the child, a really important place where those who are in practice in academia, in policy positions, NGOs, government, right across the European Union come together to talk about matters of importance relating to children's rights. So I think it's really important that we take the opportunity to acknowledge Margaret's leadership in this area. Thank you. It's clearly very timely that this event is focusing this year on children deprived of their liberty and alternatives to detention, not least because of the momentum building around this important subject internationally. And I'm going to come back to the issue of the global study in a minute. As we know, this is a very important subject. Internationally, children are deprived of their liberty in too many numbers, too frequently. And there are too few alternatives to detention. So it's a really important subject that we focus on over the next few days here in Brussels. In truth, we know a significant amount about the detention of children and the deprivation of their liberty. In relation to children under 18 years, children are deprived of their liberty for various reasons: in the justice system as a punishment, in the care system, arguably for their own protection, for health reasons, including mental health difficulties, for disability, and the latest grant for immigration purposes. What we know also is that children are detained in various places and settings. They're detained in child and youth detention centres, in facilities that can provide them with specialist care or health, in educational settings, in adult facilities too, whether it's adult prison or psychiatric services, and as I said, also in the context of immigration, where they are sometimes detained alone and sometimes with their families, but as I said, always in increasing numbers, it seems. In some cases, clearly, specialist care and therapy and education and help is available to children who are deprived of their liberty in order to get them the care and the protection that they need. But too frequently, the care and treatment that children receive when deprived of their liberty is poor, and it falls below children's rights standards. Those are set out in the multiple international instruments, in the Havana Rules, in the Guidelines on Child-Friendly Justice, in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, in General Comment number 10, and the soon-to-be joint comment on migration and children's rights in migration. They also struggle to have their voices heard, to have any visibility, and also struggle to have accountability for their poor treatment. The difficulties with the protection of children, the children's rights in detention, is at least part of the reason why under the CRC detention is a measure of last resort. We know that it's challenging sometimes to ensure and to promote children's rights compliant deprivation of liberty, but it is for those reasons that detention must be a measure of last resort, and it must be really the only circumstances in which children are deprived of their liberty must be those where there is simply no other alternative. Protecting children's rights in detention, even if we do that well, will only really ever take us so far. And so that last resort concept is really crucial. And so there's an important focus over the next few days on alternatives to detention or alternative care, prevention and early intervention. This focus on alternatives is hugely important, as is a focus on broader issues of poverty and disadvantage, but also, critically, I think, the recognition that it is through discrimination and disadvantage that many young people end up being deprived of their liberty. And it is only with that holistic focus on children's backgrounds and supportive measures that we can help to reduce both the extent of the detention of children and the poor treatment they receive in detention. When we were discussing the venue, the focus of the Fringe event, Margaret and I were of one mind that what was important today was not just in sharing the expertise and knowledge that we have, and I'll come back to that, but actually the important thing was that we try as much as possible to focus on the perspectives and experiences and particular circumstances of children deprived of their liberty, acknowledging that the young people we're talking about are often extremely poor, and they often come with poor health and poor education backgrounds. They've often experienced loss, often experienced violence, and they have very often acute and complex needs which are worthy of state attention. And as I mentioned also, the issue of discrimination, whether that's in relation to disability or minority youth, Roma, Black and Asian children, it makes it a particularly acute one for those children as well. So this is a challenging subject, and we know at the same time a significant amount about it. We don't know clearly all there is to know, and I think it is in that context that the United Nations took a decision in 2014 to request an in-depth global study on the rights of children deprived of their liberty. And significantly, Professor Manfred Novak was appointed as the independent expert in 2016. Important to document the numbers of children and young people deprived of their liberty and to record the conditions and the circumstances in which children are deprived of their liberty. This is a hugely important decision that's been taken by the United Nations, but the operation and the support, the political support that needs to come to ensure that that the potential of the study is fulfilled is really lacking at the moment. People will know that the voluntary donations have been limited so far, I understand, to Austria and Switzerland. And yet, a relatively modest budget of about $4.5 million is what is required for the entire global study. If you consider the amount of money that's spent depriving children of their liberty, this is a tiny amount of money, and it really is very important that we all both go back to our own governments with demands that voluntary contributions be made, but also that pressure be brought to bear on the European Union, particularly the European Commission, who has the means to support the global study, in particular the 1 million that is required to get it off the ground. That's the kind of political support that matters, not the decision to commission or request the study in the first instance. So I think it's really important that we focus our attention on that, and particularly in the forum. The final remark I suppose I want to make is that there is great knowledge, expertise and research available in this room on how best both to provide children deprived of their liberty with the protection of their rights, and also how to ensure that it is used as a last resort and only for the shortest appropriate period of time. There are experts here from practice areas, from policy, from academia, and of course the voices of young people will also be heard over the course of the few days. The forum is an important one to share this knowledge and expertise, but it's also one where we need to talk to each other about how best to put to practical use all the expertise and knowledge that we have. And it is that practical impact that is often so challenging, but so hugely important. So I'm sure that these will be interesting sessions over the next couple of days. It's also important, I think, that they are, while we may well all agree on many subjects, that they are not comfortable sessions, that they challenge everybody, both in terms of our understanding of the issues and our disagreements perhaps about how best to put them into practice. But it is, I think, important also that everyone here is here because they are committed to ensuring the rights of children are protected, both in custody, in detention, in all forms, and that the alternatives be a priority. So regardless of what perspective you bring, I know you all share that single aim. So I hope that you'll enjoy the sessions as we go through the various presentations, and Margaret's going to do the honours of introducing the individual speakers, so I'm going to hand back to Margaret now.
Thank you, Ursula, for that very good introduction. Much appreciated. I'm very glad that Professor Manfred Novak is here with us as well. Professor Novak, it's very good that you're here at this side event. So we have 2 sessions this afternoon, and in the first session we have 4 speakers. As Ursula said, we will also be reflecting the voice of children, or rather, this afternoon, it's the voices of adults who experience deprivation of liberty as children. So we're very grateful to the young people who are taking the time to be here over the next few days. It's very important. Our first speaker this afternoon, despite what Ursula said, whenever I think of Laura, I remember her yelling at me, "Margaret, shoot, that's not good enough," on child participation. And I asked her to come here today because indeed I think in general on child participation it just is not good enough. And I would like her to pass some key messages. Laura Lundy, if you haven't heard of the Lundy model, Laura is a professor in the School of Social Sciences for Education and Social Work in Queen's University, Belfast. And she has worked for many years in the area of child participation. And I think it's very important to hear what she has to say. Laura, the floor is yours.
So it's going to be done from there? They're not passing me the... She's happy to do it? Okay, she's going to do it. Okay, I'm happy if she's going to do it. You're going to do it? Okay. Yes, thank you. Just make sure I've got it right. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Thank you, Margaret, in spite of me yelling at you the very first time we met. It's very kind of her to invite me to talk to you today in spite of that. So I've been asked to say something about child participation, and I think it's really important that it comes up front when we're discussing vulnerability, because there's a tendency when we discuss vulnerability to forget about participation. And it's really important that any discussion of vulnerability does not eclipse agency, the child's capacity for autonomy and the child's capacity for self-determination. So whenever all of us, I suppose, are vulnerable at different times in our lives, and so are children, all of us have capacity for vulnerability, and everyone who is vulnerable has a capacity for resilience and can be resilient and needs to be resilient during vulnerability. They're connected, and I would suggest that one of the ways in which they're connected is through participation, through self-determination. That actually when children express their views about their situation, when they're deprived of liberty, that is actually a manifestation of resilience. Even whenever it comes out as resistance, as anger, as frustration, that's important that it's there because that manifestation of self-determination needs to be encouraged. And it's also a pathway towards resilience, because it's only by listening to children that we work out what they need, what they bring to that, how they can be resilient. So sometimes because we're discussing child rights, this is presented as a tension. We hear all the time about protection versus autonomy and best interest versus child's views. And that manifests itself in this tension supposedly between Article 3 and Article 12. And I would suggest that that tension isn't a tension at all. The tension is actually quite contrived, it's spurious, because actually we can't decide what's in a child's best interest without talking to them, without hearing their views. How would we know? So we absolutely have to get these things running in parallel. And the reason we want to do that is because, of course, children have unique perspectives on what is happening in their lives, perspectives that we, as the adults in their lives, just can't have. One of the very useful documents that Margaret gave us all was a collection of various views and artwork from children and young people. And I was really struck when I read through these accounts of children and young people had when deprived of liberty, was how often, in some ways, their capacity for self-expression, their right for autonomy and self-determination was often limited in the interests of safety, often in terms of who they communicate with, who they got to communicate with in terms of their family, their siblings, their friends. And it seems to me that there is a more general problem in terms of using best interest to limit autonomy in that way because of protection, that it's always a good excuse. And for me, that became really quite significant 14 years ago when I was less committed to child participation than I am now. I was more like Margaret used to be and isn't now. And that was, I did a study for the first Children's Commissioner in Northern Ireland with Ursula Kilkelly. And we listened to a lot of children's views on their lives, and this yellow bus became very symbolic for me in my journey. This yellow bus, which you can see, was drawn by a young person with learning difficulties who attended a special school in Northern Ireland. And what the young people told us in that school was that they hated this bus. They called it the banana bus, the custard bus, if you get the English connection. And they said, we're really embarrassed on that bus. We hide under the seats because no other bus going to school was yellow, only the bus for the children with learning difficulties. And of course, when you go and you talk to the adults, why is the bus yellow? The bus is yellow as a warning for safety, to let adults know that children with learning difficulties are on the bus and they might get off the bus and run across the road. And of course, it's a completely disproportionate use of something to stigmatise and marginalise those children in the interests of their own safety. So I was thinking of a metaphor for this approach to participation, and I think we often cage children. I don't mean physically actually cage children, although we know that has happened as well. But actually we build cages around children to protect them because they're vulnerable. We see them as vulnerable and we build cages. And I think I'd like us to start to think of not cages, but scaffolds. And actually scaffolds are a way in which we protect ourselves too, that we operate safely, we climb safely. And if we can see children as climbing these scaffolds, being listened to, being heard, working their way out of vulnerability towards resilience in a scaffolded way with the support of adults, is the metaphor I'd like us to take forward. But what Margaret asked me to do was really to concentrate my talk on some common misunderstandings. So I have many years now of talking to children, leading studies in child participation myself, but also talking to children about their participatory experiences, researching child participation and what works for children and what doesn't. And I thought that in the little time I have, that I would take 5 misunderstandings and suggest to you why I think that they're so. And the first, and they're all given to you in the form of statements, things that you overhear in child participation circles. And the first one is, we listen to the voice of the child. And so many years ago, I came to the conclusion that this concept of voice was really problematic, that it's a really imperfect abbreviation for what we're trying to achieve when we're trying to achieve rights-based participation. And I suggested that really we need to go beyond voice, that we need space, voice, audience, and influence. Space and voice are obvious, that we need to create safe and inclusive opportunities for children to be heard, to express their views freely. But what I felt then, and still see now, that's neglected, is this crucial second half of Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that's not just the right to express views, it's the right to have them given due weight in accordance with the age of maturity. And that often gets neglected. And I think in some ways what we have to do is say it's not just about listening to the voice of the child. It's not counselling. Counselling is important, but this is not what rights-based participation is, letting them say it in a cathartic way. It's actually taking them seriously. And for me, that involves 2 extra elements. One, often neglected, is audience. We need to find the person who has the power to effect change, the duty bearer. That's the person children's views need to get to. And then we need audience, we need influence. And that's tough. We need to ensure that children's views are taken seriously. And I'd like to come back to that. There is, Ireland has a national strategy of child participation. It's the only country in Europe that has one, as far as I know. And I worked with each of their government departments to produce a checklist of this space, voice, audience, influence model. So this is it. It's available to pick up. If any of you are interested, it's a series of, it's at the back. There are a series of questions that duty bearers, those who want to do rights-based participation, can ask themselves if they want to attempt to go beyond voice. Number 2, overheard. Children are the experts in their own lives. I'm sure many of you have heard that. You may even have said it. I certainly said it at one stage, and actually I think that's just not true. Children have expertise in their own lives. They have insights that we cannot possibly have, but they're not the only experts in their own lives. There's a room full of experts here who will have professional experience and understanding that children can't have. But also, sometimes children need help to understand this issues affecting them. Sometimes they can't see or know how something might affect them, or they don't see the range of options open to them. And in a rights-based discourse, we need to ensure, this is another model, that children have information, accessible information about their choices, their options, what's happening, what the consequences of a particular decision might be. They need an often neglected right in the Convention, Article 5 of the Convention. They're entitled to support and guidance from adults who have a duty to provide it. That can't be neglected in the equation. And if they have these, they should then be able to come to both a formed and informed view, a clarified decision where they're able to express their view in a situation. They need that help. Number 3, they're too young to understand. It's too sensitive, it's too complex, it's too anything that actually means that we're going to decide they can't be heard. And what I would suggest there is actually that is not our call. We don't get to decide that, because if it's an issue that affects them and they have a view on it, then they are entitled to express it and they are entitled to have it given due weight. It's the right of the child. It is not the gift of adults to be bestowed on them. Okay, so it's too sensitive, too complex. We need to look at why. And I've just put up one image of one of the projects we've been involved with, and that is a project for the Council of Europe on the Lanzarote Convention. And we were asked to work with children who to develop materials that explain sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. We were asked to work with 9 and 12-year-olds. And some people would say it's too sensitive, you can't go and talk to them about sexual exploitation. Well, who are the children getting sexually exploited? You know, we need to find the language to talk to them about that. So we were able to work with those children to find a language which our group said didn't scare children and didn't embarrass children. They wanted to talk about it in those ways. Number 4, it would cost too much, take too much time. Again, I think that's wrong, that actually in some ways we can't just decide on resource because sometimes it just doesn't cost much. Talk is, in fact, cheap. And when you talk to policymakers, as we have done, actually it doesn't take money to get in a room. And what's interesting, I think, about children in detention is actually one of the hardest things in most child participation is getting access to children. Well, that is not an issue when they're in detention. You know that they are there. The other issue is representativeness. Again, they tend to be there in smaller units. Talk to all of them. You don't have to choose. So some of those big hurdles in other areas don't exist to the same degree. And finally, number 5, and this is what I'm currently working on and thinking hard about because I'm getting frustrated every time I hear it, and that is it would be tokenistic. And I've said it myself, we shouldn't talk to them, it would be tokenistic. And I've started to really problematize tokenism because it seems to me that often people use this as a kind of honorable way out. We can't do it, it would be tokenistic. We couldn't possibly, we wouldn't abuse the children that way. And again, I think there's no other human right that I can think of that actually you would say, because we can't do it properly, we're not going to do it at all. You know, we're not going to give you any education because your education, we can't give you a good education, so you're getting none. So I think that is just so inappropriate. And I think what we have to start to do is think about the reality of child participation, for any of us in this room have done it, is that it's always messy and it's always imperfect. There could always be more time, more money, more resource, more access to children, better ways to talk about it. And so tokenism sometimes can be a start just to get into the conversation with children. I want to clarify, I don't think tokenism is ever appropriate for a decision affecting an individual child. That's never appropriate. You should just not be tokenistic. You should just do it properly. But when it comes to talking to children as a group, on our laws, on our policies, on our procedures, we just need to get on and do something. And in that, another point really to add to that is actually tokenism is something adults think about. And we've done a lot of research with children. And what they're telling us is that actually even when adults treat them tokenistically, don't underestimate their ability to take the space and claim it back and actually work it. And we've watched children do that many times. So this is a quotation from one young girl in Latin America who was arguing, was in an adult forum with 3 children and hundreds of adults. And you can hear her saying, I was surrounded by adult journalists. I took the floor to ask my question. I attracted everyone's attention. I took advantage to speak in the name of all children. No more violence, no more human trafficking. Don't underestimate children when adults plan to be tokenistic. And so finally, I'm going to finish on 2 questions to cut across the forum. And I'm wondering and it's really just a tentative thought, I'm worried that sometimes we make a normal human interaction, adults talking to children, which happens every day across the world in the country, seems so complex that actually decision makers are petrified to begin with to do it. And if they do that, if adults, decision makers, think they can't do it because they can't do it properly, and they need elaborate consultation mechanisms and don't do it, we're shutting children out of decisions. And finally, which is the other thing to take across the forum, is actually how do we not be tokenistic? How do we really encourage more respectful engagement? And if you recognize, as most of us would, that participation is a dialogue, it's an important dialogue with adults and children, that one of the most critical junctures of that dialogue is the point where adults give feedback. They tell children what they've decided and why, even when they're telling them, you asked for this and we can't do it, and these are the reasons. And often that feedback is completely lacking or really, really inadequate. And I'm going to suggest to you that actually that this is the point we need to concentrate on, that feedback should be fast because children obviously grow up quickly, that it should be most crucially full, that if we take a decision for a child, that we have to explain what we agreed with, what we didn't agree with, what we're doing, why we're doing it, why we're not doing what they asked, in detail so they understand that they have been part of a decent, rights-respecting process. And finally, it should be child-friendly and accessible to them and followed up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's a big ask to ask any expert to cover their subject matter in 15 minutes. But there we got a masterclass in child participation, and I think it's really useful. And if we can all bring that with us into the forum, it'll all be much better. Thank you so much, Laura. Our next speaker is Maria Varna, who is a clinical psychologist. She works with the Cordelia Foundation in Hungary in the area of asylum migration, working with victims of torture, and she also works in a hospital, but today she's going to talk to us about the area of asylum migration and child immigration detention. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here and giving me the chance to talk to you in 15 minutes about this topic. As Margaret already introduced me, I'm working on the field, so I am not from the policy area. So what I will be sharing with you is mostly my own experiences and as little psychopathology as possible. I also promise myself every time that I talk on international forums not to be whining about the situation in Hungary all the time, but I do have to actually engage in that a little, because what we are doing on the field is actually trying to deliver psychosocial care and psychiatric care to asylum seekers and refugees in Hungary. Cordelia Foundation has been doing that for 20 years, over 20 years now. We have been present in all the important asylum and immigration detention and reception facilities in the country. This has been true since March of this year, when the transit zones in Hungary have been set up. Since since then, practically all newly arriving asylum seekers, apart from unaccompanied minors under 14, are detained in these transit zones. And not only they are detained there until the end of their asylum procedure, but they are being deprived basically of the services of all those NGOs that have been assisting them since this asylum system as such exists in Hungary. And this means also that the Cordelia Foundation, including me and all my other therapist colleagues, are excluded from the transit zones, so we are unable to provide psychiatric and psychological care there. The reason why I still have expertise with children and families and young adults in detention is that asylum detention regime has been existing in Hungary also prior to the transit zones. So, and I also meet all those families and children who regain their freedom at the end of their asylum procedure, and they are being let into the country, while knowing at the same time that they are the minority. Where do I have to direct this? So a couple of bullet points of important things about the effects of detention on mental health in general. So as you might well know, the migrants who are detained independently from their age or whatever other characteristics, they face more severe and more specific stress factors than others. More than 50% of those who end up in detention suffer from some kind of mental health problem. This is independent from their country of origin, from their prior mental health status, from their age, gender, or whatever other aspect, and it is also independent mostly from the country where detention takes place. Also, another very important point to stress is that mental health consequences of detention are long-term. It means that the consequences last for much longer than detention itself. They can manifest even years after detention takes place, and this is increasingly enough for children, true for children. So what does detention mean from a mental health perspective, from a psychological perspective? Mainly what it means is complete disempowerment and loss of control on all important aspects of one's own life and one's own coping mechanisms. So it means a lot of loss of sense of justice or meaning. It means a loss of predictability. And when we are talking about asylum or immigration detention, this is increasingly important because we are talking about people, about families, children, who by default are in an uncertain situation when it comes to their future, when it comes to their legal status in the country where they are. And this is topped with all this sense of disempowerment in detention. People in detention are isolated from their community, from their cultural, from their religious practices, and they are isolated also from the community that should, on a later stage, hopefully integrate them. So when we are talking about unaccompanied minors detained in Hungary, we are talking about the fact that while these children go through this prolonged detention, they don't meet any Hungarians apart from the armed guards in these transit zones. So they enter the country, even if they are recognized and they are granted international protection, they enter the country after long months of having been in detention and without having experienced anything other than the circumstances of detention. This is actually a picture of the transit zone. So when it comes to detention of children in particular, what I would like to stress on is two subgroups that are different in many perspectives. One of them is the children who arrive with their families and they are detained together with their families. And the other group is that of unaccompanied minors in detention. And what I would like to show you here is a very short video, less than 1 minute. It's a video made by us, by Cordelia, and the person whom you will see is our ex-patient with his son. He obviously agreed to participate in this. And what I would like you to observe simply is the dynamics between the father and son here. And I would kindly ask Dana to stop the video when I tell you to. Sound would be also important. Yes. So as some of you might have guessed, this father, he has severe PTSD, and what you could see in this symbolic way on the video is how these intrusive thoughts, intrusive memories affect him in his daily life, while in the meantime he's trying to take care of his son. And you can just imagine how such a person with such a severe traumatic background functions and manages to take care of his kid in detention while he's deprived of those basic coping mechanisms that allow him to carry on in daily life. So what I wanted to stress on with this video is that the key to the mental health of children in detention is clearly through the mental health of the parents. So if parents become unable due to detention circumstances to function as care providers, as providers of the security that children are in need of in order to stay healthy, then the whole dynamics of the family get disrupted. You might have heard of this term of parentification. I promise I won't use any other psychiatric or psychological terms here, but parentification is when the child has to take over the role of the parent within the family, either from a psychological point of view or also from a very practical point of view, because the parent is unable to attend to his duties either emotionally or practically. This has very severe consequences on children's mental health, and this is something that we see very, very often among asylum seeker families. This, of course, can result in actual separation of the family members too, because if the parents become unable actually to function healthily, then they might even be placed under hospital care, for example. The detention has, of course, effects on children's health in many different perspectives. I won't be going into details here, but what we see both on adults and children is that anxiety, depression, and PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, is a triad that is very important to keep in mind. PTSD, obviously, can result from detention itself, but we have seen very often also that detention re-traumatizes people who already arrive with a traumatic background. When in the case of children, physical health aspects are also increasingly important, and developmental aspects as well. So since the whole environment of detention is so far from something which is ideal for a child's upbringing, cognitive development can also be impaired, especially in long detention times. They have observed this in several studies. The other group that I wanted to talk to you about a bit is that of unaccompanied minors in detention. This picture actually is from a very recent reportage of National Geographic. I don't know if you've come across it. There are hundreds and thousands of unaccompanied minors stranded in Serbia waiting for being welcome or being let into the EU, an EU that does not want them. And they arrive to the doorsteps of Europe, to Hungarian transit zones, for example, after months or even sometimes years of traveling on their own and being severely abused on all possible levels, and not being anymore neither children nor adults. And this is an aspect within this group that is very important to focus on, not only as mental health providers, but basically anybody working on the field. So these kids have a very severe burden on them of having to make it, having to provide for their families in one way or another, while at the same time they are still children. So when we are coming back again to these coping mechanisms and ways of just being able to, carry on in life, what we see is that children, young adults, have very different ways and sometimes less mature ways to cope with such difficult surroundings as a detention center, for example. So aggression, substance abuse, and self-harm and even suicide are phenomena that are unfortunately increasingly linked to this very young group. I wanted to talk to you, or just to mention briefly, the case of one of my patients or clients, Sifat, who is actually since the last time that I mentioned him on such an event, the things have turned in a very unexpected way for him. He is a boy from Afghanistan, approximately 16 years old, who arrived to Hungary 9 months ago. And due to the fact that age determination procedures are very, very problematic in Hungary, he ended up in an adult detention facility, and he spent there multiple months, more than half a year. In the meantime, his asylum request was even refused, and only the court, when he appealed, the court was the one that not only restarted his procedure but also recognized the fact that he's a minor. In the meantime, his family was evacuated at home. His brother died, and when he was released from adult detention, he was actually placed back in the transit zone. And that's when I lost contact with him, being unable to enter the transit zones. And after, again, almost 3 more months, he was released 2 weeks ago with a subsidiary protection status. And after 8.5 months of detention in Hungary, practically the moment that he got status, he fled from Hungary, and he is now somewhere in Western Europe. So he didn't, in all this time of almost an entire year, he didn't get anything of what we could call protection, and his current situation is as unsure and as insecure as it ever was. What I can say about the changes in his personality is that he was a very mentally healthy, young, extroverted guy who, after 8.5 months, basically became a shell of himself. He completely closed down. It was very actually traumatic, even for me, to follow him through this process. And what Laura just mentioned, this word resilience, it might be maybe the best to capture what happened to him, that he lost. What he lost is actually resilience. What he lost is this capability of fighting for his future. I have many other such sad examples, but actually what we see on the field in Hungary is that detention affecting children is something that is an increasing phenomenon. So that's why my other examples would not be much more positive either. But thank you for having given me the opportunity to share a bit this individual perspective on this whole important topic, and I'm ready to discuss this further with any of you in the break. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, and I'm really grateful to Maria because she had other commitments this week and she rearranged her schedule to be here. I listened to her in Prague at the DMC event in September, and I'm very grateful, Maria. Thank you. That was very valuable. We'll continue on the topic of immigration detention, and now you're going to hear our first personal testimony from a young person who also spoke in Prague. Pinar Aksu experienced immigration detention as a child together with her siblings. And Pinar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Margaret, for inviting me over, and to International Detention Coalition for giving me the opportunity to share my experience with many people. My name is Pinar Aksu. I was born in Turkey, but when I was 8 years old, my family started seeking asylum in the UK. We were sent to Scotland as part of the dispersal program in 2001. As asylum seekers, life was not easy for us and the many people. And basically what happens during the dispersal program is, I'm sure most of you know, in UK, you get sent to different cities and you get sent to other places which you don't know where it is. So when my family was sent with many other families, we were put into a bus, and we were never told where we were getting sent to, so we had no idea where Scotland was, and it was about 8 to 9 hours of driving, and then the driver was like, this is it, this is you in the community. As asylum seekers, you're not allowed to work, and in the UK you're only allowed to get £36 a week. Moving country, understanding the new community and seeking asylum comes with many barriers, as I have mentioned. And around 2006 in the UK, Home Office started detaining many families, including mine. During that time and before that, there wasn't a procedure where what to do with the cases and what to do with people seeking asylum. So in 2006, the UK government and the Home Office started detaining many families, many people, many children, and started to send people back to their country. My parents, my 2 younger siblings, and I were detained for over 2 months in an immigration removal centre called Dungavel, which is the only detention centre in Scotland. And then we were sent to Yarlswood down in England. I describe the Dungavel and Yarlswood as a prison, as I don't see any difference between a detention centre and a prison. They are both secured by immigration officers and by the government, and you are left behind barriers and left behind walls. We were treated as criminals. Governments use many different words to make these policies sound acceptable. However, it is the same, as I was being deprived of my liberty without cause. Our rights as citizens were taken away from us. As a child at the time, I saw many things that no child should see. I saw violence as families resisted being returned to their homeland against their wishes. I even saw people committing suicide by drinking shampoo or by tying themselves with shoelaces and different other ways as well. And the reason why many people committed suicide is because they had given up in hope, and they saw that the only way out of being out from detention centre was to die. The UK has no time limit on detention, so no one knew when and why we would be out, which made it difficult. We were not criminals, we did nothing wrong, but even criminals in prisons know when they will be getting out. After spending 2 months in there, we witnessed many families being sent back to their countries, and I had formed a relationship with people at my age who I still keep in touch with. And the sad thing was, when weeks passed, you form friendship and you form connection with the people inside the detention centre. And then seeing that loss of connection when they get sent back to their country, you kind of sort of start questioning humanity. After a while, 2 months, there was some campaigning done by the community and by Glasgow Campaign to Welcome Refugees, the Unity Centre, who are kind of network and group of peoples who help asylum seekers. And they've done a campaign on my family. And luckily, and I say that because there was many people who got sent back to their country, my family was one of the few families who were out from detention centre and who, after being out from detention, got our leave to remain papers in the UK. After this experience, you were talking about how children share experience. One of my teachers of modern studies, he just said, there's a conference happening. Do you want to go and speak and share about your experience of what happened? And I was 15. I was like, yeah, sure, why not? This is exciting. Not knowing what's waiting for me. He said only 20, 30 people, but there was about 250 people. So since then, I've kind of been campaigning and working with asylum seekers and refugees. I've completed my degree in community development, then I went to do a master's in human rights and international politics. And I'm a community development worker at the moment, working in an integration network, helping new families, children who are arriving to Glasgow. When I look at my experience, it is clear that my first experience of seeking asylum was far better than the time I spent in detention. I have now learned that the first program I was involved in, which is seeking asylum, is the kind that many experts call an alternative to detention, allowing for people to live in the community while they wait for their migration status to be clarified. The work that everyone is doing at different capacity to make alternatives to detention available across Europe is important, especially as even short periods in detention can have horrible, long-lasting impacts on children's health and development, as we have heard. One important strategy to help end child detention is to engage with the local people building connections and organising meetings, multicultural and community events and marches to welcome refugees, such as during the UN Anti-Racism Day, which helps to create a platform to understand one another. These types of events help to educate and connect people so they know there is no them and us, and there is only one human race, which is, there is only us, which is the human race. Engagement relies on dialogue and understanding, and campaigns at local and national level must have elements that dispel myths about migrants and refugees, and work equally to empower refugees and migrants and show the positive role that we play in the community. Alternatives to detention, as I said, I see, which is another possible option, is children living in houses with their family. And this has shown that it costs less, if this is what the government is worried about, people coming over to the country, taking our jobs. This is the classical things that I hear, the basic argument. So this method costs less, allows people to get support, and it is more humane. We must ensure that alternatives to detention are exactly this, and not alternative forms of detention. For me, a person should not be detained for seeking safety and refuge in another country, let alone a child. It is a very basic human right not to be tortured or treated inhumanely, and not to be discriminated based on race, colour, religion, and birthplace. As we all know at the moment, we are going through the so-called refugee crisis, which is a term I don't like using. It's more of a humanitarian crisis than a refugee crisis, because we all knew this was happening, but we didn't do, and the EU especially, and many other agencies didn't act on time until it hit the wall, until it hit the border. One of my friends who works in Greece with the DCI Greek section, I was messaging her this morning to get an update of what is happening in Greece and what is the situation with detaining children. So she sent me a voice message which I would like to share with everyone.
Hi, my lovely.
Oh, sorry.
So, I will read you something from the latest report of Defense for Children International in Greece that I'm working on at the moment on the detention of unaccompanied children. This is happening due to the lack of guardianship in our country, and they have named it protective custody. There is an alarming increase in the number of unaccompanied refugee children detained in police cells and detention centers under the called protective custody. Due to the chronic shortage of space in suitable for their childhood facilities and pending their placement in one of them, unaccompanied children are often detained in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. They're placed in small cells with unrelated adults where they have little access to information about their rights and to basic care services. This situation often acts as a deterrent reason for unaccompanied children to disclose their real age and registered as adults at the identification centers. If detention is what can be best provided as an alternative to no secure accommodation for children, then the failure of the protection system is tremendous, a legal officer in an international organization in Greece told us. Many of these children are detained while awaiting to be reunited with their family in other European countries. In this regard, there is an imminent need of legal assistance with such asylum and family reunification processes, as well as strong links amongst European states where the family members are present. And now we'll read you something which is related to their mental health issue as a result of their detention. One of the main challenges in relation to the detention of unaccompanied refugee children is their mental health state. This is an emerging issue that receives very little attention. Most of the unaccompanied refugee children are exploited in parks of Athens or detained in detention centers and are facing serious mental health issues, including drug addictions. The first night I was placed in a detention center, I was so scared that I was dreaming nightmares of myself being killed. Still sometimes have such nightmares. 14 years old unaccompanied boy from Iraq. Unaccompanied children have encountered extremely harmful experiences that have left a mark on their fragile mental health. Their mental health condition becomes even worse once they arrive to Greece and are imposed in prolonged detention.
I just want to share this to show that whether it's in the UK or it's in Greece or in the other parts of the country or in the world, the same conditions and the same effects are very similar and same, whether this is affecting the mental health or it is putting someone into a detention center and not being and blocking and not having and giving the opportunity for a child to fulfill their childhood. I would like to finish by saying that, in my opinion, no person should ever be detained. Using methods such as age assessment and detention will only traumatize the child. Especially in the UK, the immigration system needs to go through a major reform, as there is no, as I have mentioned, there is no time limit on detention, and it's actually the only country in the EU which doesn't have a time limit. So somebody could be detained for a month, 2 months, for a year, or for many, many years. And also, just to give an update, in the last month, 2 people have committed suicide in detention centres across UK, one being in Dungavel in Scotland and one being up in down in England. So I really do appreciate for inviting me here. I'm one voice, but there are many voices who are being silenced and who are not having the opportunity to share their stories. I really do hope that there is a positive outcome from this conference, and the politicians and the governments and the NGOs do put their act together and make a proper change. Instead of talking all the time, more action is needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pinar, for sharing your experience and giving very clear advocacy messages from your perspective. And thank you also for the innovative use, I must say, of technology. I've never seen anyone do that before, but it worked. Thank you. Our last speaker in this session is Astrid Podsiadlowski, who is the Head of Sector for Rights of the Child in the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. And Astrid will try to give an overview, hard as it is, of all the FRA research that is relevant to the topics being discussed over the next few days. Astrid, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for your testimonies and for your examples, your individual examples. In the agency, what we are doing is one of our tasks is to provide this so-called evidence-based advice based on fieldwork research, not only but largely, and so we also try to kind of learn from the experiences of different groups of people. And what I'm trying to do is to present some of the findings that we have related to children in vulnerable situations and putting them at risk of being deprived of liberty. So, if you look into this question with of vulnerabilities and deprivation of liberty, there are two parts to this.
Maybe just move a bit towards, because you're kind of between two.
Okay. Okay. But there's a picture, sorry. I go here. Okay? Yeah. Go here. Yeah. Thanks. I need to see my pictures. Thanks. Well, if you look into this question, it's the one thing is the increased risk of children in vulnerable situations being deprived of liberty, and then also children being deprived of liberty and the effects. And we heard already very strong findings on this. And we do see a severe lack of data, so we very much welcome the efforts of the UN Global Study on really learning more about the circumstances of children and the impact deprivation of liberty has on children. And of course also on this forum to bring people from different areas together, working with different groups of children, for example, and being at risk of or who are deprived of liberty. And we heard already this part about this protective custody. And we have, in one of our research, we interviewed children about their experiences in judicial proceedings. And we had also children telling us that they were also kind of put into protective custody in police stations at night, who were, for example, victims of violence. And this is what, for example, one of the girls told us. It was a locked room with dirty sheets and blankets, dark everywhere, mice, rats, things like that. There were 2 beds, a couch, a table and a chair, a white ceiling, white walls, a cabinet like this one here, a bed over there, a bed over here, a table, bars, very dark. So this is definitely no way which you can call protective custody. And also from, we can see similar accounts also from the hotspots, and we heard already accounts on that. We have been also present regularly to observe the situation, and if maybe now that the last visit, the situation in the hotspots in Greece has improved with regard to unaccompanied children. Still children with families are in detention or parents are in detention, they're separated. And then also the problem comes then to the mainland where children are continuously put into so-called protective custody in police cells. So from our side, as the agency, we have very clear opinions that migration status or asylum-seeking status is no reason whatsoever to deprive children of liberty, and that protective custody is not a way to go in any way. So I'll try also to not only talk about asylum-seeking children, but about different groups of children. And so what do we know about, based on our research, vulnerable groups of children, which puts them at risk of being deprived of liberty? We have heard about asylum-seeking children, and I don't want to talk about all slides, but I put those data in also for maybe a useful reference point, because I think they will be shared as always. But there are several countries where detention of unaccompanied children asylum procedures is allowed, and some others where it's not allowed, it's also happening. And also, if then maybe it's not allowed due to asylum-seeking procedures, then we have to look into the situation, return procedures. And it's really very likely that a child in an asylum-seeking process in the different phases of his or her travels during arrival in the European Union, transit zones, but also in return procedures, is detained. When we look into children who have been, who are European Union citizens or have maybe not only newly arrived, if you look into children belong to an ethnic minority group, for example, or having migrant status, we can see from several works that we are doing that there's a very high risk of segregation and discrimination. And for example, one major point is segregation in education, and which remains an issue throughout the European Union. For example, we found that children with a migration background experience de facto segregation in their schooling in just under half of all European Union member states. And also Roma children are overrepresented in so-called special schools and find themselves often in segregated schools or segregated classes. We have also this participatory research in local communities with Roma and non-Roma community members, and also try to work also more in a way to really learn from the children and the young people themselves what would improve their situation. But we also have learned continuously in these local case studies that parents who are non-Roma try to see that their children are not attending schools where a high proportion of Roma children are attending. We also know from our research on justice that we have quite a few examples of Roma children who feel discriminated against when involved in judicial proceedings, that they were not properly heard or were not asked for their opinion, and also that they think their views were not taken into consideration, and they associated it largely with prejudices, cultural barriers, language, lack of support. There's another big group of children who are very vulnerable, that are the children who are at risk of poverty. The risk of poverty and of social exclusion, as I think we have all learned during the last month with the release of new data, is a reality. There's a high proportion of children in the European Union. From the latest data, it's 26.9% who are at risk of poverty. We also know that this is strongly linked to the parents' educational level and the country of birth. And also from our research with Roma, also with ethnic origin, with a decreased access to services, for example, to health, education, housing. There has been this, I think, very relevant case at the European Court of Human Rights, Soares de Melo versus Portugal, where the court concluded that Portugal violated the right to respect for family life. It concerned a family from which 7 of a total of 10 children were forcibly taken into care with a view to their adoption, because the mother did not provide the children with adequate material living conditions. And this case adds to existing jurisprudence that establishing that poverty as such is not a reason to deprive a child of parental care, and that authorities need to sufficiently support families for them to be able to adequately take care of their children. So these are figures also for your reference, where we can see there may be some decreases in numbers, but particularly in those countries, the figures are still very, very high, so for a later reference. Another situation which makes children very vulnerable is potential disability. Is strongly associated with discrimination and difficult access to justice, which is even more difficult when the children are living in institutions. And also in the research on children's treatment in judicial proceedings, professionals that we interviewed stated that children placed in institutions with or without disabilities are very often not heard in proceedings. We also know the increased risk to experience violence, and also the increased risk of economic inequality, again having a strong link to poverty, due to the fact, for example, that parents, usually one caregiver has to leave employment to take care of the child. So children with disabilities appear to be very vulnerable, much more vulnerable than all other children. There's no system to take care of children with disabilities in the system. Everyone passes the problem on to the other. As soon as we are confronted with a child with those problems, all of a sudden we see the failure of the system, which was not conceived in order to take care of those children. We also know that persons with this disability are much higher to feel excluded from society. This gets even more impeded if they have this very severe impairment or low economic status, but it's a vicious circle, as I said before. Shortly, I also wanted to address the increased risk of violence of certain groups of children. I've conducted a survey on experience of violence of women during their childhood, and the numbers are also, again, very high and too high, and across the European Union countries, and also the increased risk of discrimination, violence, bullying, for example, at school, of children who self-identify as lesbian, gay, transgender, or bisexual, as well as intersex children. Also as a group to point at these groups to be particularly vulnerable. So these were a bit of some snapshots of maybe to steer the discussion to also think about different situations children might find themselves in. But of course the important question is how to support vulnerable groups of children so that they're not at risk of being deprived of liberty. So really looking into the preventive part And if children are deprived of liberty, what are pathways out? So I think these are, from my understanding, also 2 questions for this side event. I'm very interested in hearing the discussions and from experience from colleagues. One point clearly is to ensure children's access to justice, to ensure their right to information. We again also heard before already like the importance of information, and particularly also when it comes to child participation, to really understand and to ensure that children know about procedures and know about their rights, that to really fulfill the children's right to be heard, to learn, to include their perspective and learn about their opinions. And in relation to children, discrimination means that our opinions don't count because we are children and our opinions are not treated seriously. Adults think that children at the age of almost 14 don't know what they are talking about. And we had a lot of statements like these from all different age groups, and yeah, I very much agree also with the first presentation on this very arbitrary age limits on hearing children, and it's a child's right. It's not a parent's or adult decision. Alternatives to detention, I understand this will be also a topic for the next 3 days. So we have also, we really can only say, for example, when it comes to immigration detention, those need to be worked on, there need to be the resources, and also on a case-by-case basis to see what's the best solution for a family or a child, or child and his/her family. To move into community-based services, so that individuals, and I think that was also an example that Pina said before, like really working together with the local community, interact, have a dialogue, so that also it's possible for children to really grow up in a family environment as opposed to an institution. States should refrain from using austerity measures impacting on the provision of support, as well as from investing in services within segregated institutions or in guardianship arrangements. So in closing, I put together a few points that we have identified in these different pieces of research as promising steps to support children to decrease the risk of vulnerability and also the risk of being deprived of liberty. To think of also what specific support children in their specific vulnerable situations need, be it with disabilities, be it an asylum-seeking child, be it being at risk of poverty, to empower children through their active involvement, to learn from children themselves through their participation, to not only hear their voices, but learn from their experiences, consider them, move them, put them forward, and give children the space to speak. This also goes into the issue of having comparable data on the situation of children in vulnerable situations, the likelihood of being deprived of liberty, the consequences or way out, and also to consider in this lack of comparable data really the different situations children may find themselves in, to really have segregated data on different age groups, ethnic origin, migrant status, age I said already, disabilities. Support and involve parents in schools and local communities for them to be able to care for their children, for example, when being unemployed or at risk of poverty, or to have to really work on advocacy and community-based work to advance desegregation, for example, also to coordinate housing and education policies to avoid segregation. These are some steps, and I'm sure we will learn more what other colleagues are thinking. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Astrid, and I must congratulate all speakers on this panel. They kept to the time. I don't think I've ever been at a conference where I've seen people finish in time, so well done, all of you. I'm obviously a very scary person, that's good to know. So now we would like to open the floor to discussion. If you are given the floor, please remember to state your name and where you're from, your organization, and to use the microphone. So who would like to take the floor? Who do I see? Rachel, Brett down the back, and then Melanie. First two. Did you say Benoit? And Benoit. So, Rachel.
Rachel Brett, Children of Prisoners Europe, COPE. Thank you very much for all the presentations. Very, very interesting. A couple of comments. First of all, in relation to Laura's presentation on child participation, one of the experiences from Children of Prisoners Europe is how often children are lied to or failed to be informed about having a parent in prison. And this has terrible consequences for the children because they can't, very often, of course, they figure it out. Which means that they know they're being lied to, they can't ask for more information, they can't ask for help, and they have this sense of betrayal even from their own parents very often because of this. So I think it's really important to sort of think about it in that way as well. Secondly, I wanted to commend Maria on that really clear statement about the mental health of the parents being so critical to the mental health and well-being of the children. And again, this is exactly the experience we have when the parent is in prison, not just in relation to the imprisoned parent, but to the other parent or other carer who is looking after the child. The children cope much better if their carer is coping well, but that is very often not the case. And then finally, for Astrid, the one area you didn't mention, in fact, on which the FRA, I know, has done, at least produced a table, is in relation to children who are in prison with a parent and which countries within the EU permit this, which is most of them. Mostly it's mothers. A few do permit it for fathers to have a child in prison with them, but also the different age groups that this applies to. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. Melanie.
Thanks. I wanted to thank all the speakers. I'm Melanie Teff from the International Detention Coalition, which is a coalition of around 300 NGOs around the world working to end immigration detention of children. And I just wanted to comment on, I think it was Ursula Kilkelly, who had rightly talked about a number of issues, such as detention of children always being a last resort. In the context of immigration detention of children, we would argue that this is that we're at a moment to actually end immigration detention, and we're at an exciting moment, given that governments around the world made the commitment in the New York Declaration at the end of last year to work towards ending the practice of immigration detention of children, and not just as a last resort, but ending it. And so we see this, this forum as an opportunity to look at alternatives to detention that make immigration detention of children completely unnecessary. Thanks.
Thank you, Melanie. Benoit?
Thank you very much. Benoit van Kerswil from DCI, Defense for Children International. Thank you to all the speakers. It was really inspiring. I'd like to maybe ask a question to Maria concerning the length of the detention and the effect of the length of the detention on the health and the mental health of people. Have you seen any situation or experience where a very short detention period also has the same kind of consequences? Or because sometimes we hear, okay, it's only for a very short period of time, but still it seems that there is an effect on the mental health of people. So I don't know if you would like to comment this. And then I just want to mention, when it comes to participation of children, and especially participation of children in detention, we are for the moment running in Belgium, and it's run also in some other EU countries, a EU-funded project, dealing with participation of children in detention in the juvenile justice system in the evaluation and monitoring of their own detention. Just this is to mention, it's going on for the moment, so we will come up with some results and some experience because we think that it's very important also to ensure that there is participation, and the difficulty is to ensure valuable and meaningful participation in that frame. So I'm happy to discuss this with the person who would be interested, and one of my colleagues, Julien Atwil, who is here, is also involved in this project, so he could present it in more concrete ways. But this to mention that participation of children in detention is probably also a even bigger challenge in regard to what Laura has presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit. Before I pass the floor back to Maria and the rest of the panel, perhaps one more question or comment here from the front.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm Zsolt Szakás from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. And I was very happy to hear that that ending detention as reality for children does pose itself within reachable distance. But what we see on the field in Hungary, as it was very well said by Maria as well, is unfortunately quite the opposite. And although I'd like to be very positive and optimistic about the potential that it was laid down, of course, a few things need to be, I think, marked. First of all, that as we see in Hungary with an increasingly authoritarian government, is that children are used as tools. They are dehumanized and only referred to as migrant. Of course, not just to mention all the legal all the violations of European and domestic Hungarian law, which come with the systematic detention of children on the border, which is indefinite. I think we need to be aware of the fact that that the detention of children doesn't only bring up obvious causes of violation of law, but also very different aspects which need to be addressed when talking about ending detention of children, which should of course be ended as of immediate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maria, would you like to take?
Yes, so thank you, Benoit, for your question. I thought to highlight two things about the effect of the length of detention. One of them is that as you might well know, a very large proportion among asylum seekers suffer from post-traumatic symptoms, from PTSD. And what I see in detention is that, yes, of course, longer detention obviously affects one's mental health more than a short-term detention. But in the case of people with PTSD, the decompensation in detention can happen almost instantly. Detention has a very strong capacity to re-traumatize traumatized persons. Why? Because it very much resembles the environment of a prison, as Pinar said. So those people who have been imprisoned in their country, who have seen armed guards in contexts where those armed guards have beaten them up and have tortured them, or they have simply been detained in their country of origin for whatever reason, if they get in an environment which resembles a prison and where they are surrounded by armed policemen, that is something that can have an instant and very, very strong effect on their mental health. This is one thing. And I'm not talking only about adults here. I have met many, many unaccompanied minors in detention, Afghan boys, boys from Syria who have been detained in their country of origin and tortured. Another thing that I wanted to mention is what also Zsolt very well said, that that the length of detention, and also, also Pinar has mentioned this is very important. In the case of asylum detention and immigration detention, the length of detention is pretty much unknown to the person who is being detained, and this is just unimaginable. So they simply don't know whether it will be 1 month or 2 months. And in Hungary, when we are talking about the fact that every asylum seeker is detained for the whole period of their asylum procedure, the reason why we say that that is indefinite is that it really is. It can take years with multiple appeals, with multiple procedural, steps. This is why we say that it can take basically as long as we have come across many people who have finally managed to enter the transit zones after having spent months in Syria, and they just gave up. They just gave up because you cannot survive if you don't know how long it's going to last. And they just went back to Serbia.
I suppose just a couple of comments before we break for coffee that cut across the different presentations. Obviously, we've heard different perspectives on the detention of asylum seekers and refugees, and that, while it is a relatively recent phenomenon vis-à-vis other forms of deprivation of liberty, it is being undertaken on a scale throughout Europe and around its borders that is quite catastrophic in its potential, I think, including the fact that the conditions of detention, as Maria's outlined and others have pointed to in terms of the FRA studies, also have the potential to impact not just on those who are detained, but on their wider families and on generations. So I think one of the concerns that we may well come back to is that the enormity of the concerns around migrant detention in some respects risk dwarfing some of the other challenges that we have, that they're so considerable and serious. So I think we will endeavour over the next couple of days to address the whole range of issues relating to deprivation of liberty, but mindful that this is a very acute problem for those who are deprived of their liberty in the migrant context for all of the reasons that we've heard. And also, I think, particularly because it is, as we've heard already from Pinar in particular, it is detention in many respects without cause. And I think that level, the impact on the person of the uncertainty, as well as the lack of rigour around procedure and accountability, makes it a particularly acute problem. So there are, I think, themes also more positively of resilience and how to protect as well as respect the rights of those who are in various forms of detention that we will come back to over the course of the session. So I think it's probably wise to have a coffee break now.
Okay. Indeed, let's stop for coffee. Thank you so much to all our panellists. I would ask them not to leave the podium but to move over there so they can participate in discussions afterwards. We will start again at 16:40. Please, when you hear the bell, if you could start making your way back in. It's going to be a bit like the army over the next 2 days, there'll be bells and everything, but enjoy your coffee. Thank you all very much. Okay. Welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. Astrid, please take a seat. Would you like to take your seats, please?
Glass.
There are no glasses in here. That's annoying, isn't it? Isn't that an annoying sound? Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Let's get started because we have quite a long session ahead of us, so hopefully you've had enough caffeine to keep you going. We have 6 speakers in this session. So I'd like to pass the floor to Professor Hugh Williams, who focuses on clinical neuropsychology at Exeter University. By the way, I didn't tell you earlier that we have a listening room, which is also our publications room, 0C, where you can find copies of different publications from the Commission from FRA and also from other organisations. And there are also copies of Professor Williams' work, so please make sure at some stage to go visit that room. In there, the Council of Europe PACE campaign to end immigration detention, they also have a desk where you can go and sign their petition. So there's somebody sitting very lonely in 0C at the moment, waiting for people to go and sign the petition. Okay, 0C, publications, sign the petition. And if you feel that this room is too crowded and you want to take some time out, it's connected. You can listen to the discussion still in there over the next couple of days. So, Professor Williams, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for asking me to come here to give a talk on brain injury, neurodisability, and young people who end up in secure systems or prisons. As just heard, you can go and sign your names, but also pick up resources. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is in these resources that we produced recently as policy guides for people interested in trying to bring about some change in the criminal justice system when it comes to kids with neurodisability. So I'm going to kind of skim through quite a lot of my overheads just to give you some of a bit of an overview, and I hope it's not too quick, but to give you an overview of this area. The first place to start, oops, if this works. Oh, did you press this way? Ah, there. Oh, this way. Sorry, I was holding the thing upside down. So the first place to start is brains, and why that is because so many kids who end up in the criminal justice system have brains that have had some form of injury or some kind of lesion at some point early on. I'll come to that in a bit. Brains are amazing things. You all have one. There's about 100 billion neurons in your craniums, and each neuron has about 10,000 connections to others. The neurons towards your front of your brain has about 30,000 connections. That's where your really complex neurons are, and they're the neurons that create your consciousness and your decision-making ability and your impulse control areas. As you can see in this overview, this is how the brain develops over time from childhood through to late adolescence. And over here, as the brain matures, the colors change. The last part of the brain to fully mature, between 19 and 21-ish, is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this area here, that's to do with long-range decision-making and holding back on doing something, so doing things with some reflection. And obviously, the age of criminal responsibility in many countries is down over here, way before the brain has matured into being able to do the job of thinking ahead and all the rest of it. And one of the big problems for children where they are growing up, especially when there's adversity and where there's a lack of socio-economic security, is that they may end up having traumatic brain injuries. I'll come to you a bit more about that in a moment, but just to explain a bit about brain injury. Brain injury is when the brain is injured in an event like an assault or a car crash. So over here we may have somebody who's been hit by blunt force in the head. The brain moves around inside the skull. The brain hits the inside of the skull and moves around and backwards, kind of, for example. So the areas of the brain typically affected are frontal, temporal, and limbic systems, which are these areas. And you may remember that those are the areas important for long-range decision-making, thinking things through and holding yourself back from doing something you might then regret, i.e. impulse control. And this area... just to kind of maybe force the point home a little bit, as the brain is sitting inside the skull is there to protect the brain. This part of the skull is nice and smooth on the inside, but the bottom part of the skull, the basal part over here, is not smooth. There's a range of bony tissue that holds the brain in place. So as the brain comes to a fast stop, as you would in a car accident, or if you've been hit with a baseball bat, the brain moves around a bit like a blancmange or a jelly on a cheese grater. So that's why, a horrible image, but I want you to hold that image in mind, because that's why you end up with these lesions in the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes. Temporal lobes are important for memory, frontal lobes are important for conscious decision-making and judgment. So there's different kinds of brain injury. The main form of brain injury is mild, so being knocked out for up to 20 or 30 minutes, and then moderate severe brain injury, which is 20, 30 minutes or more of a loss of consciousness. The consequences, brain injury is the biggest cause of death and disability in children and young people, biggest cause. So it's often neglected because people don't tend to know about it because it's an invisible disability. The brain may be injured, but you can't see it like a wound in the arm or wear a break. It's not visible, therefore people don't take account of it. Around the world, about 10 million people per year are affected by traumatic brain injury. And the people who are most affected by brain injury typically will be young. So over here we see the classic spike, that it's the adolescents who are affected by brain injury, between 14 and 21. And the other group are massively affected are the under fives, toddlers. They're toddlers who walk about and toddle about and they fall, especially from low socioeconomic groups. So lots of brain injury happen in the young, and that affects behavior over time. The type of issues after brain injury might include what we might call organic personality change, because your brain has now been changed to some extent. It typically, in terms of being more irritable and not being able to manage your temper that well, and also not being able to remember that well. So after a moderate severe brain injury, there's a likelihood of a major personality change in, say, 50% of people. After mild brain injuries, in 10 to 30% of people. Just hold that in mind again. So I was quite intrigued as a neuropsychologist. I come from a neuropsychology background in terms of looking after people after brain injury, around the forensic background. I was intrigued that so many offenders are described as having problems with impulse control, controlling their emotions, and so on and so forth. So it's intriguing for me to then look at how many people who end up in a criminal justice system may have had traumatic brain injuries. And also how traumatic brain injury might be related to crime. So there's a really good study by a colleague of mine, Sina Fassell, looking at the total population of Sweden. And what Sina discovered was that if you look at 35 years' worth of the Swedish population, and you link data between the healthcare records and the records for crime, you find that 2.5% of Swedes become violent at some point in their life, but 8% to 9% of those with brain injury become violent offenders at some point. So a brain injury multiplies your risk for becoming somebody with a violent crime kind of history. And that's twice more likely than a sibling from the same socioeconomic background. A more compelling, an interesting case from New Zealand is that New Zealand researchers have found that if a kid has a brain injury around the age of 5, by the time they're about 10, they're twice more likely to have attention concentration problems in school, and then they drift to the back of the class. By the time they're 12 or 13, they drift out of school and get excluded from school. And by the time they're 15, they're twice more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. So this drift into crime is to do with social exclusion, especially from education. Recent data from various German studies would indicate that people who end up in prison as adults compared to people who are not in prison, or people in, tend to have many more lesions, particularly in the frontal parts of their brain. And you're much more likely to have lesions in these parts of the brain if you tend to be a violent offender. We've done a range of studies in the UK and with collaborators worldwide by now, where we looked at the rate of traumatic brain injury in prison populations. And this is an example study. So you expect about 1 person in 10 to have had some kind of head injury at some point. 2 people in 100 have a moderate severe brain injury, and then maybe about 10 people in 100 have mild head injury. In the prison population, the level is something like 60%. So 2 people in 10 of young people in prison have moderate severe brain injury, and another 4 person in 10 have a mild or repeated mild injuries. Traumatic brain injuries. So these are losses of consciousness who are leading to changes in brain function over time. Given this data, a few years ago in the UK, we set up, as part of a new comprehensive health assessment tool for all young people coming into the secure estate, a system for screening for psychiatric caseness and for neurodisability. And in the first 100 of the children that came through, we discovered about 80% had some form of brain injury. And when we looked at the background of these young people with traumatic brain injury, particularly with a more moderate severe type of brain injury, we find that more than half are self-harming and more than half are also suicidal. And that's not due to depression. Also, many more come from a care home background. We were asked by the Office of the Children Commissioner in the UK a few years ago to do a review of the number of kids in custody around the world who may have a neurodisability, like traumatic brain injury, and these are some of the figures compared to the general population. So we expect, for example, brain injury to be 3 or 4 times higher in kids in custody. Autism spectrum disorder in 15% of kids in custody compared to less than 2% of the general population. Attention deficit disorder also very high. But the thing to really pay attention to here is communication disorders. So in about 5% of the general population, there are communication disorders. In 60 to 90% of kids in custody, there's communication disorders. So they don't follow what's going on, and they're not quite sure how to respond to requests that have been made of them. Of course, what we want to do is try to make sure that young people do not end up in secure systems, that they can be in the least restrictive environments one way or another, and so on and so forth. But it's quite interesting to look at the kind of data that, on things like traumatic brain injury, because we can try to explain some of these key issues for society to do with, for example, recidivism and reoffending. Reoffending is incredibly high. Half of people of young people come out of youth estate in the UK end up reoffending, they get reconvicted within a year, but 75% within 2 years, which indicates the system doesn't seem to work to help them change their behavior. And it's incredibly important to try to take account of things like traumatic brain injury and communication disorders in this population, otherwise behavior is not going to get changed. We have made a case recently around the financial burden of not addressing things like traumatic brain injury in the young people who come into our criminal justice system in the UK. And there's a full report on this if people want to have a read. Effectively, it turns out that brain injury causing crime probably leads to something like £3 billion a year of cost to our economy. And that money should be better spent on keeping kids in schools and in more inclusive environments and in communities. In the UK at the moment, there are some current reforms going through. The Scottish Parliament and the London Parliament of the UK started to take account of some of these issues, with the Justice Committee of the UK recently announcing that there needs to be a change in our prison systems to take account of some of these neurodisabilities. And hopefully that will happen, and there have been some interesting examples in other parts of the world where these kind of issues have taken hold. For example, in New Zealand, Judge Beecroft, you can see over here, saw the table that we produced on the number of kids in neurodisability in prison, and they reviewed the New Zealand justice system to take account of neurodisability. Therefore, if you're assessed as having neurodisability, you're a lot more likely to be given a community sentence that's restorative justice within a culturally sensitive environment. In the UK as well, at the moment, there are some other interesting initiatives being developed around providing more sensitive trauma-informed care. So, for example, in Wales, the Youth Justice Board has developed a more clinical psychology formulation try to identify underlying adversity factors that lead young people into crime, and therefore how to address these issues more effectively, which has resulted in a drop in crime and a drop in young people being sent into custody in Wales. And that's a system that's now been piloted in other parts of the UK. There's also a secure stairs model that we hope will be taken on board into the future in the UK. So these are some of the other examples that you might want to read more about in reports that are available online. So here's a young man who's 17 at the time where we put in a brain injury link worker into a prison. This young man had huge amounts of problems in terms of being able to keep with the program that he was supposed to be in. And was being quite violent and throwing things at staff and not engaging with the prison staff or with other people within a young offender unit. It turned out in the medical records he had a fractured skull. The fractured skull was on the left hemisphere of the head, and the left hemisphere of the brain had been affected. And effectively, as assessed by our brain injury link worker who was put into prison, he was shown to have a verbal ability of around at the first percentile. In other words, he was not able to follow verbal commands, but his visual systems, which had not been affected, his injury was due to his father taking a chair leg to his head, hitting him. So his visual systems was not impaired, and using pictograms and using visual material enabled him to then understand what was going on. So your next mealtime will be at such and such time, or your next ability to go and play pool will be at such and such time, as visualized on pictograms, helped him to settle down on the wing, and within 3 months he was on a community program. As I mentioned, there are other systems being developed in the UK, like the enhanced case management approach through the Wales Youth Justice Board, and that again is available in the materials given to you. Oops, in the wrong direction there. And the main message would be that it would be much more beneficial for societies to spend to save and don't wait to fail. Young people, particularly exposed to adversity, typically having neurodisabilities that compromise their functions, and therefore they're not being enabled to develop ways in which to manage their own behavior. Brains develop in society. Brains need to be around other brains to become minds. You need to be able to communicate and be able to be accepted by others. So to borrow an analogy from economics, by investing early and while in our children's development, we increase the rate of return in later life, and in doing so improve not only the lives of individuals, but societies as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Luckily, people, you do not need to have memorized what's on those slides. You just need to know where to go to get the information. Copies of some of the publications are in room 0C, and just remember Professor Williams' work, and I think it's great. We can all be much more aware of traumatic brain injury. So you don't have to memorize, just use it again. Our next speaker is Kaloyan Stanev. He is a researcher with the Bulgarian Helsinki Committee, and he's going to focus primarily, I think, on children in conflict with the law. Kaloyan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you for this amazing opportunity to share our experience with everyone in the room. As Margaret said, I'm Kaloyan, and I'm from the Bulgarian Helsinki Committee. It is a big human rights NGO from Bulgaria, and we just turned 25 this year. What we do is we have worked on the topic of prisons and detention for more than 20 years, but what we have is we have an agreement with the Ministry of Justice so that we can visit prisons unexpectedly and we can talk to persons detained there. So my idea for today is that I want to try to share for a very short period of time a glimpse of what is the situation in the juvenile prison in Bulgaria. We have only one. there is one for boys, one for girls. Fortunately, there haven't been any girls for the last 4 or 5 years detained there. So, yeah, actually, last week when I was preparing for this presentation, I paid a visit to the juvenile prison, and oh,
There.
sorry, I'm really sorry. As I said last week, I paid a visit to the juvenile prison just to talk to the boys there and see what's going on and what is the current situation there. And an interview with a 17-year-old boy just made me go back all the way to the start, my very first visit to an institution. It was in 2013. We were working on this big project together with our colleagues from Hungary, Poland, and Romania, called Deprivation of Children of Their Liberty in Central and Eastern Europe. And we managed back then to visit more than 56 institutions and talk to more than 150 children. And it was my very first visit. It was in something called correctional school. We have this separate system in Bulgaria that deals with children in conflict with the law that have done the so-called status offenses. And so we have these schools that are part of the general educational system, but children can be deprived of liberty there for up to 3 years, sometimes more. The very first child that I spoke to was a 12-year-old boy who was recently raped by 5 other boys from the same institution. What happened was a terrible incident where there were some foreign volunteers in the school who were engaging with the boys, and someone stole some money from them. So the result was an immense amount of physical abuse, of psychological humiliation to all the boys. And those 5 boys that raped the other boy, they were the main victims of this abuse. So when I went to the prison last week, I spoke to one boy that was there during that time. He was 13 back then, and we could chat about the incident. We could chat about the person involved and what was the situation back then. And he is now in the prison. So it kind of go all the way back to the very beginning where we started. So I would, how does this work?
I think you just press no.
Okay, it's the other way around. Sorry. So I would just wanted to start with a very short introduction of our system because I think it is important. We have 3 distinctive systems in the global term of juvenile justice system in Bulgaria that are working very separate to one another. So we have the criminal justice system, which deals with children who are above the age of 14. The age of criminal responsibility in Bulgaria is 14. So if you commit something against the law, you are going through that system. If you are younger than 8, you can only be subjected to protective measure through the child protection system. And then we have this system in between. We call it the juvenile delinquency system. It dates back to the 50s. And it is quite common in Eastern Europe. So there, children who have done things that are not deemed crimes and adults would not be persecuted for, they go through this system. And it is just running away from home, running away from an institution, begging, prostitution even. And the harshest measure that you can get, as I said before, it is you can go to these correctional schools for up to 3 years. Some very basic statistics. Last year there were more than 6,000 registered criminal offenses conducted by children in Bulgaria, and as you can see, most of them are connected to thefts and robberies. So in last year again, there were just over 100 children who received effective sentence for deprivation of liberty. At the same time, at the beginning of this year, there were only 27 children in this prison. What happens is that the rest of them, they practically serve their sentences during their pre-trial detention. In Bulgaria, we don't distinguish between adults and children in terms of the period that you can spend in pre-trial detention. So a child can spend up to 1.5 years in a pre-trial detention center, depending on the gravity of the crime they're prosecuted against. And there is no organized educational or any kind of activities in these centers, and some of them are in such a bad condition that there are actually no opportunity to go outside. There is just a room where you go for an hour just to walk around. So how do these children come in contact with the system? So if you steal something, for example, and you get caught, you go to the police station. We have had cases of very young children, for example, a 9-year-old girl who spent the night in police custody just because. So each year we make this study on the levels of police abuse and access to a lawyer in the police custody. So we interview prisoners who were sentenced recently about their experience in the police. So the last such study, we interviewed 17 recently sentenced boys from the prison. 2 of them are reported they were abused by the police during the arrest, and 10 of them reported they were abused inside the police station itself. And here I have just two examples of what does it happen. So we have children who are kind of immobilized, and then abuse is inflicted on them just so that they can confess. This is partly happening also because we have a very huge problem with access to a lawyer inside police custody. The access is very much hindered because we don't have an obligation for a lawyer to be present there from the very start of the custody, when all the questioning happens and where children are kind of made to confess if they have something to confess. So when you talk with the boys about their experience with the lawyers, even some of them actually have a lawyer. Most of the time it is a legal aid lawyer, but we don't have any system for specialized youth lawyers in Bulgaria. So a boy just told me how the last time he was in the police, he wasn't arrested. He was just summoned for questioning, and then he went there and, oh, there is this guy, he's a lawyer. So he didn't choose him, he never talked to him, he never saw him. They didn't have any conversation before the questioning. The questioning took place, the lawyer was very kind of passive, and then they said, okay, give me your number and I'll call you. And then the next time the boy saw his lawyer was in the court, just before the hearing started. And the lawyer told him, okay, you will just say yes to everything I say. Fortunately, the boy in this case asked the judge that he's not happy with that lawyer, so they changed it, but not all of them are this. So we go through the court, and then you're sentenced to go to the prison. This is what the prison looks like. It is, as I said, one for the whole country. It is situated in a very small town in Bulgaria. It's some 200 kilometers away from the capital, with poor transportation links and a very limited access from the parents and from the other relatives. We have currently 25 boys there. More than 80% of them are of ethnic minority origin. As you see, 17 are from Roma origin and 3 boys are of ethnic Turkish origin. There is a very high connection between the type of crimes that they have been sentenced for and their ethnic background. As you see, 15 boys are there for thefts and robberies. 14 of them are from ethnic minority background. So according to so they're in the prison, they make this very basic assessment of the child background. So they what we see is that 15 of them had lack of solid parental figure, 14 of them were living in extreme poverty, and 8 boys have had either one or both of their parents being involved in crimes themselves. 12 boys were previously placed in those correctional schools that we talked about earlier. 11 of them were, again, of minority origin. So who are they really, those boys? So there is a very striking example that I would want to share. This 14-year-old Roma boy, he had 44 police registrations for thefts before going to the prison. His father was sentenced multiple times, his mother too, his whole family is involved in crimes. He actually started stealing when he was 8 because his father took him with him to do something. And now, at this moment, his brother and his cousin are in prison. 2 of his sisters are in a correctional school. He himself has been in such a correctional school for 3 years before going to the prison. So we have, and at the same time, we don't have any record for child protection measures towards this boy. There is this other case which is very similar, and they just you just see the cycle. You go into the system, and then you go through the correctional system. It doesn't work, and then you go to the prison. The next boy is actually this boy that I talked about in the beginning. And as an illustration of how the whole system works, one of the prison officials told me about this document. It's an official document they received when they asked for some documents for the file of the boy. And it says there is no institution or a person in Bulgaria that can handle the case of this boy. It was just one of such cases. So why is all this happening? We have been long criticized for the lack of a reformed juvenile justice system in Bulgaria. It's the recommendations of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child date back to 2008. What happens is that the best interest of the child is not incorporated into the criminal justice system and into the correctional educational system. So we have this notion that children who are in conflict with the law are not deemed as children at risk. So they don't actually receive protective measures from the child protection system. It was in this previous study that I mentioned when we visited the prison that it was the first time that the Child Protection Agency actually involved in an inspection on what's going on there, just because we alerted them of a very high level of physical abuse in the prison and an awful lot of other violations, human rights violations in the prison itself. So now we have this whole process kind of evolved, and we managed last year to have a brand new act, a draft law called Diversion and Implementation of Educational Measures Act, which tried to reform the system and to bring it into the perspective of the international standards and to end this system of correctional schools and systems of places where children are deprived of their liberty just because they haven't done crimes, but because they have not been intervened properly by the protection system. But it's still there. It's still in the ministry for this whole year. And so now when I was there in the prison, it felt like we are back in the beginning. The numbers are smaller because we don't have that many children these years. Most of them that have immigrated to Western Europe, but it is still there. The whole system is still there, and we have these broken lives. So yeah, thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Kaloyan, for that very important presentation. Thank you. Next, we have Jan Frubauer from Prague in the Czech Republic. He works with children in very vulnerable situations. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here. And I don't know, I saw quite a lot of bad stories and sad stories. I hope this one would be a bit. Let's make a break from this. When I was thinking what to show you, first of all was one big case appeared to me, which we made with one couple, and actually let's make it a bit like a Hollywood movie. At the end was a happy end. So my name is Jan Friebauer, and I am the manager of the social programs in Jahoda, which means strawberry. Jahoda is an NGO in the suburb of Prague, and just say that we cooperate with the Dynamo International and Czech Street Work Association, and that's all what I say about this organization and now about Jahoda as a whole. Now you can see that's our target group, most of the target group. It's quite full of diversity, and we like it like this. But on one hand, you can see there is not only minorities, but even the majorities, which is the most important for us, because if we want to include the people in the society, it's the best to mix them. So this is cheerful kids, which we really like. Who are these kids? These kids are mostly from environment who is full of violence. There is a poverty, maybe not so strong poverty, but in compare with their peers, they live in poverty. They have problems at schools, and they have no institutional leisure activities. There are problems with their hobbies, and so it means that most of the time they spend their leisure time on the streets, boring themselves. That's why we are there. We are there to show them, first of all, some leisure time activities, and on the other hand, also some information, counseling, coaching, mediating, not meditation, and that's what is our the main goal. Why we work with these kids. There are some principles. We work individually with the kids. Yes, the point of view of family is important, but for us is important the kid, the child. Okay, it could be a bit difficult time to time, but still, we really come close to the children to talk about their problems at school, in the family. The kids, they can use some nicknames. There is anonymity, strictly anonymity. Okay, if they want, they can tell us their name, but we don't want it. What is the most important? It's logical, long-term cooperation, because after maybe 1 year, okay, if it's just a simple problem, yeah, we can just give them some information. But if there is something really crucial in their life, the most important is if we are in contact with them for 1 year, 2 years. And we like the statement client-oriented attitude, and that's normal in the Czech Republic, not normal within these programs for kids and youngsters. Time to time we try to protect them, time to time we show them, time to time we guide them to the officials to be on their side, to show them that there is still on their side. Now, short video, and we can start with the case, please.
Pomáhají mi vlastně i s bydlením, s mýma osobníma problémama, vlastně teď mi pomohli taky hodně s mým miminkem.
Okay. So, these two people, you can see actually they are not kids anymore, even if when we met Lucy and Peter, Lucy was 16 years old, Peter was 20 years old. They are a couple. I met, actually, before I became a manager, I was a street corner worker. So we always, we call it a key worker, key client, maybe it's similar. Peter was actually my key client. I knew a lot of things about him. I was his social worker. In 2015, Peter told us big news. Wow, I have a new girlfriend, and that's her. And he is from Prague, and she wasn't from Prague. She was 16 at that moment, and she lived in small town close to German borders. She decided to move from that city with the knowledge of her mother. Knowledge is not the best word. She decided to move to Prague. That brings us new information that there is actually a really weak influence of her mother. She wasn't so important for her. She didn't care so much for her. On the other hand, in case of Peter, we realized that his mother is quite strong in the family. He is like a mother of the family, and and he was quite influenced by her. In both cases, they faced in the future or in present the fact that father was in prison. In case of Peter, it was at his sixth age of year. In case of Lucy, it was present status. She didn't communicate with him. How she was responsible, but she was self-confident. She could be quite focused, but on things which, according to us, wasn't so important. And she was quite energetic, young, beautiful girl. On the other hand, he was punctual, low self-esteem. We had hours of talking about his self-esteem, how he should behave, and so on. But he was honest and fair. But there was one problem. He has a lot of mysterious guys from his environment, from his peer group, which were mostly dealers of marijuana, and he used to smoke marijuana. Wow, in 2015, new information from Lucy. She is pregnant. She's pregnant with Peter. This situation brought quite a lot of, according to us, a lot of threats and risk, which they didn't realize. First of all, they lived by Peter's mother. Soon they realized it's not really good to live together with the old family of Peter, because all the time there were argues about money, about the job of Peter, about how they should housekeeping and so on. So the pressure will increase, but not only from the side of the mother of Peter, but the pressure came even from their inside. Now inner side. Now they realized that it will be maybe for a longer time the relationship than they realized, and starting small things like flirting with other girls, flirting with other boys, and at one moment it looks that they broke up their relationship. At that moment, we talked with them, and slowly they started to realize that there could be some problems. First of all, single mother, that Lucy could be single mother. She would return to the little town where she was born, and on the other hand, the Peter couldn't visit them. There will be in this issue missing father. So slowly they started to realize that there could be same problems as in the case of their own childhood. And at the end, there could be the most crucial risk, institutional upbringing or foster parents. after that. And I must admit, they really started to they started to do their best, and they started to cooperate not only with us, but they haven't the knowledge how to solve these problems, this issue of their familyhood, how to start a new family. And there were several institutions that help, and we found some professionals who can help them. We counsel with them quite a lot of things. Very important was birth assistant for Lucy, that she started to work with her body when she was pregnant, and she started to know what is important for her. They were mediating with some officials, especially employee agency, which is could be quite cruel in the Czech Republic if you, as a young boy or as a young lady, if you want to start to work, it's you can imagine how officials could be at these institutions. And the last point, the coaching. They really start to think how to change their situation. At the first time, housing was the most. They changed four flats, let's say 2 shelters for single mothers, and two flats. And we help them. We help them with some small things like calls, jobs, shelter, and flats. And at the end, within this 1 year, we decided, we realized that, and they realized how they teach quite a lot. And they knew quite a lot of things about their parenthood, family, and social policy. And what's different was self-esteem of Peter. And the special point I put here, the old family. Time to time, it's really important if the clients, if the youngsters, young people, at least for a while, broke their communication with old family. If the old family has a bad influence on them, and in this case, it was perfect because it helps them to start new possibilities, and now they can communicate with them again, and also, yeah. There are also these practical solutions. So, why I say this all? At the end, everything happened as it should happen, and now the core family was saved. They are together, and last time I spoke with them, I asked them if I can use their example for this meeting, and yeah, Peter walks, Lucy is at home with the kid, they have fled. They fight their normal life. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. There's so much discussion around family support and early intervention, and it was great to have that lovely example. Also hinting at all the work that goes into it, but how necessary it is and how valuable. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is from Serbia. Nikolina Milic is a human rights lawyer in the Belgrade Center for Human Rights, and she's going to talk about unaccompanied children. And as you hear, she's very enthusiastic and eager, so I'll give her the microphone. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Margaret, for inviting me to speak here about this really important subject. On behalf of organization which I work for, it's called Belgrade Center for Human Rights, and it is with its 22 years old experience, one of the leading, one of the oldest and most experienced organizations in Serbia. And since 2012, we are implementing partner of the UNHCR in Serbia in the area of providing free legal aid and representation to asylum seekers and refugees. So this is extremely important, having in mind that Serbia does not have the law on free legal aid. So the only legal aid that asylum seeker who does not have the money to pay a lawyer can have is to engage one of our lawyers or the lawyers from another organization. So Serbia was particularly challenged since the beginning of this so-called refugee crisis. Since 2015, mostly one of the reasons is because we adopted our asylum law only in 2008. So we are not experienced in this field. And integration was something that we started speaking about only in 2016. Serbia is by many, because of that and because of other things, because of our economic situation, Serbia is by many refugees who are now in Serbia seen as a mere transit country. But due to the border restrictions, it's it's a reality for thousands of refugees for periods often extending 1 year. Since the beginning of the crisis, Serbia adopted this genuinely humanitarian approach, receiving thousands and thousands of refugees and migrants into its territory. However, it still has to adopt a systematic approach for ensuring full and effective legal protection to them, especially to unaccompanied children as one of the most vulnerable groups among refugee population. According to available information, 1/5 of all children who are residing in one of 18 reception and asylum centers in Serbia are unaccompanied by their parents or legal guardians. This information is also to be taken with reservation because we don't have uniformed, comprehensive statistics on number of unaccompanied children, because we also don't have the age assessment procedures whatsoever. So it's really hard to determine, first of all, how old is a child, because we don't have even the psychologist who could speak with children. That's being done by a police officer. Or usually, if child is being represented by us, if we see that it's a child and not adult, so then we would deal with the asylum office trying to pay their attention that it's a child in place. But if, let's say, if that child would not, if that person would not have legal representation, he would be treated as adult in asylum procedure. It's really hard for authorities and to ascertain whether children are traveling alone or with their parents or some relatives, because they usually come in a group and they think they're advised by people, by their smugglers or by their parents, to say that they are a part of one family, and they actually are not. Also, the data collection is inconsistent because authorities only count a number of children who express their intention to seek asylum and number of those who are residing in these residential institutions. But the situation on the field is completely different, because there are many children who are unregistered, who did not seek asylum and do not reside in reception centers, so the number is very much greater. And for this reason, that we don't have statistics, we don't have the numbers, it's really hard to plan any, to establish measures to ensure adequate support for these children. Even though certain progress can be seen when compared to previous years, unaccompanied children who are residing in Serbia still face numerous difficulties in exercising their fundamental rights. This often happens not because of the lack of systematic solutions prescribed by law, because our laws are mostly in line with international standards and international law, but due to insufficient familiarity of officials with guaranteed rights of the child, or due to small, because the children are usually being treated only as refugees or asylum seekers, but rarely this component of a child is taken into consideration when making decision. Or this is happening due to small number of guardians, who are legal guardians, who are usually appointed by centers for social work. because in practice sometimes happens that one guardian is appointed to more than 60 children. And the ratio per child protection minimum standards in humanitarian action is not more than 25 children per one guardian. So consequently, the appointed guardians, even with their best wishes and willingness to help a child, are not able to have regular contacts with them or to provide them with the necessary care. In many reception centers, unaccompanied children that we have talked to are not even aware that they have a legal guardian who is assigned to them, as they did not meet them. Also, an additional obstacles rises from the lack of interpreters for specific languages, and the fact that these interpreters are provided by NGOs and not by the state. Guardians, if NGOs would not provide these translators, guardians would not have the means to communicate with the children that are under their guardianship. In the absence of effective guardianship system, it is impossible to identify child's particular vulnerabilities and exposure to various forms of violence, sexual exploitation, or abuse. When it comes to asylum procedure, in which Belgrade Center for Human Rights has an expertise, child's legal guardians are usually not familiar with the mere basics of international refugee law or asylum law provisions. This can be very harmful, as they should make sure the child's best interest is well respected by the authorities during asylum procedure. In cases where a child was able to access the asylum or willing to access the asylum procedure, a child would face different problems, namely Serbian asylum law in practice in general. In practice, is being characterized by automatic application of safe third country concept principle, which in practice mean that all asylum application by people who on the way to Serbia crossed some of the neighboring countries that Serbia deems safe, their asylum applications are being refused, not even going into the merits of the decision. So this practice is in Macedonia and Bulgaria and all of the neighboring states are safe when it comes to this decision. This practice is particularly dangerous in case of unaccompanied children, because they are usually ordered to leave Serbia without taking into consideration possible harmful consequences of returning an unaccompanied child from a refugee-producing country without a travel document, without the means to support himself, to a country which he or she crossed on the way to Serbia, which is, in most cases nowadays, Bulgaria, a country which is in many reports by treaty bodies and international organizations being described as not safe for persons likely in need of international protection. Serbian law prohibits returning children if the authorities are unable to secure proper reception in a country where child should be returned to, and this prohibition is still disregarded by default, as the authorities rarely even contact such third countries, but merely give expulsion orders to children, ordering them to leave Serbia in 7 or 10 days. This problem was also addressed by the European Commission in a progress report, but also in recent reports by the treaty bodies, namely the CRC and HRC. Unaccompanied children who did not seek asylum in Serbia are in irregular situation and are in especially difficult position. These children have experienced greater difficulties in exercising their fundamental rights, and the right to education and social inclusion was pretty much unattainable. However, by the end of September, with the support of UNICEF and local NGOs, progress was made in school enrollment, and around 500 children, among which are many unaccompanied children, are enrolled in primary schools. And there's an effort to also allow them to facilitate their enrollment in high schools as well. Due to the commitment of the state to provide humanitarian care to all migrants, the accommodation at one of the reception or asylum center was usually available to all unaccompanied children, regardless of whether they are asylum seekers or they did not seek asylum. Also, there is, according to relevant instructions and guidelines of the competent ministry, unaccompanied children should be accommodated in one of 3 residential institutions that have separate units for unaccompanied children. In practice, however, unaccompanied children are generally accommodated in a regular reception or asylum center, while there is genuine effort by the management of these centers to provide specific facility or even a room for children. They are often accommodated together with adults, generally in overcrowded conditions. The situation is especially serious given that the unaccompanied children don't spend their days, but it's months, sometimes even a year. The situation in respect to accommodation and reception of unaccompanied children raises serious concern about their exposure to risk of violence, sexual abuse, exploitation, and human trafficking. There's an urgent need to ensure proper accommodation in order to prevent criminal activities targeting them and to protect those who have fallen victims to human trafficking or to violence and abuse of children. Failing to identify and adequately support these severely vulnerable children, some as young as 9, who have fled war or poverty and traveled under the radar for thousands of kilometers without a parent or a guardian, often causes desperation, which is for many children a push factor that pushes them into the hands of smugglers and traffickers who are promising them a better future in Europe. So often trying to earn money for the continuation of their journey or to pay off for the previous journey. They are exploited by smugglers often and manipulated into working for them. Smugglers are often using children who are under the age of 14 to support them in gaining new clients because these children are not cannot be criminally prosecuted for criminal offenses. Unaccompanied children also who are encountered on the route or who are already in the countries of destination report they have walked in for days and that they have been experienced violence by smugglers or law enforcement during their journey. There is also a frequent reports of unlawful pushbacks from one country to another along the route, in some cases using violence, including by authorities of Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Macedonia, and Bulgaria, affecting many children. There are many reports on the internet that you can find. One of the most recent is by the Médecins Sans Frontières, addressing this particular issue. Some children reporting attempting to cross borders several times and having suffered beating and abuse by law enforcement, which is really something that we should all think about. Also, considering the legal framework and situation in practice of protection of unaccompanied children in Serbia, even in cases where we have a whole set of guaranteed rights in the law, there are numerous obstacles in exercising these rights in practice. Number of unaccompanied children is rising from one month to another, and based on what's happening now and what we see from the policies of the other countries, this trend will probably continue. Therefore, it's really necessary to work together to establish an effective system for protection of children in the shortest possible time, because we already missed so much time has passed, and many children are suffering because of that, which should be in accord. So we need to, especially in terms of healthcare, including psychological support, education, social protection, and care, and to think about durable solutions, which is something that we have started thinking in only at the end of 2016. So this is primarily an obligation of a state, but also civil society organization should not be left out of the entire process, which is usually what's happening in our country. But because we can also largely contribute and support the state bodies and institutions in the improvement of practice of protection of unaccompanied children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikolina. That was great. Good overview. You managed in 15 minutes. Well done. Next, we have Angus Mulready-Jones, who's the lead inspector for children in detention for England and Wales. And Angus will be talking about children in conflict with the law and also immigration detention. Angus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. just a small health warning. I've been coughing and spluttering all day, so if I start, halfway through this, I apologise in advance. Just a bit of background. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons coordinates the National Preventative Mechanism in the UK, and we inspect all places of detention. There's police detention, court detention, criminal justice detention, so prisons and the remand centres as well, and immigration detention. The main area that I'm going to focus on today is those prisons that are holding children. I may draw on some of our findings around immigration and police detention as well. Just to give you some way of background to the English system, there's no point in trying to read all of that, but there are 3 different types of detention centre that we have that hold children. The majority of children who are held in custody in England and Wales are held in what are called young offender institutions. So there are about 900 children in custody at the minute, of which around 650, 700 are held in young offender institutions. These are, broadly speaking, larger institutions holding between 100 and 200 boys at any one time. They cost around about €100,000 a place. Then we have secure training centres, which hold boys and girls, and they hold about 180 children in those institutions. They're about twice as expensive as a YOI. And then down at the bottom there, we have secure children's homes, of which there are several, and between them they hold around 100 young people who are in conflict with the law at any one time. Now, there is some rhyme and reason to this system, but needless to say, it doesn't always work as it should. What should happen is those younger, more vulnerable children are held in secure children's home, and as you get older, you move through the system, or you have fewer vulnerabilities, you move through the system. As I said, it doesn't always function as it should. In terms of my role, I don't inspect secure children's homes, so we're going to talk, broadly speaking, around the secure training centres and the YOIs. Oh, bear with me. And for the things I want to cover in this presentation are vulnerabilities of children as they come into custody. And I think we've talked about this already in many different ways, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. And then some of their vulnerabilities as that they have by fact of being in custody. So there are 2 sort of halves to this presentation. So, if that works? No, yeah, there we go. So in terms of our population and demographics, you can be sentenced to custody in England and Wales from the age of 10, although very, very few people are, and all of them are held in secure children's homes, which is the same setting that they would be if they were held for welfare reasons. It's the same providers, it's the same setting. So of the 900, we have about 4% of them that are between 10 and 14, and the rest are over 15. About half the population at any one time are aged 17, and that's been a fairly static figure. We do have a disproportionality issue around our ethnic minority population, and that's been getting worse as our population has been getting smaller. So England and Wales has had some success over recent years in reducing our population of young people held in custody, but as we've reduced the number of white British children held, we've reduced the number of black, Asian and minority ethnic children at a slower pace. And so they now make up about 44-45% of the population, compared to about 18% in the wider population. So there's a significant overrepresentation of those groups. And there are a whole range of different reasons for that. But a simple heuristic is that those groups tend to be more disadvantaged in society across England and Wales. Now, I'm going to focus on areas that haven't been covered already, briefly to talk about some of the problems that the institutions holding these children face, and that is their existing vulnerability. So this looks at some of the education outcomes of children before they got to custody. And as you can see, nearly all of them have been categorised as persistently absent from school before they get there, and about a third of them have been permanently excluded from school before they get to the prison. If we move on, we look at special educational needs. This is some quite dated data, if you will excuse that slightly inelegant way of putting it. And if you look at the dark blue bar chart, you'll see that's the proportion in the population at large. And the light blue, the lightest blue, and the sort of medium blue are children in custody sentenced to more than or less than 12 months in England and Wales. And the two charts relate to whether you have what was a statement and is now called something different, but essentially that means that you get some money attached to you to meet your educational need. And you'll see that in custody, around half of the population have some form of additional educational need that doesn't have money attached to it, and a good number of them have, about 20%, have a special educational need with money that's been recognised with money attached to it. And if we look at a different area going forward, and I think this is the starkest difference to the population at large, is the number of children who are incarcerated in England and Wales that were previously looked after by the state. So we look at about 1% in the general population. These figures show a population in custody of around 30%. In reality, it's much higher because there are different groups in England and Wales that have some that are looked after or the state has some responsibility to. And so if you took the whole picture of looked after children in custody, you would get a figure closer to 50%. And I want to emphasise the point here because while that means that the looked after children, those that have been looked after by social services, are massively overrepresented in custody, it doesn't mean that that proportion or anything like that proportion of looked after children end up in custody. The reverse stat, if you like, isn't true. It's only a small number of looked after children that end up in custody, from the tens of thousands that looked after at any one time. But there is a sort of shocking reality to the fact that in England and Wales, the largest provider of care for young people looked after by the state is the prison service. So we have these people who come into our prisons, and they come into our prisons with all sorts of pre-existing issues that haven't been dealt with, by and large, for 16 or 17 years. And this is one of the main problems, I think, with custody as a concept for this age group, is that they're not there long enough to do anything about it. So this is the average length of stay in one episode in custody in England and Wales. And if you were trying to design a service that were going to address some of the, maybe the pre-existing brain injuries that we've heard about, maybe some of the social stigmas that some of these children face, maybe their educational issues, maybe their attachment issues if they've come in from the care system, I don't think you would design a service that was going to do that in 118 days. Now, this figure masks massive disparities. We have children that spend, who are sentenced to several years in custody, but 85% of them are given a sentence of less than 12 months, which makes it very difficult, no matter how much money you throw at these institutions, to address the issues that they come in with. Now, and that's not me saying that you should lock up these children for longer. That's me saying that you might want to think about doing something more than we've already done to address those short sentence children, because they do not go out of custody in any better state than they came in, which is a real issue for society at large. And as I said, I think it's unreasonable to expect an institution to turn around or even assess properly the issues that some of these children have, given the time frame. And an anecdote that I had from a recent inspection of a secure training centre was there was a child, this happens more infrequently now, thank God, was that there was a child in custody for taking a car. He was remanded in custody on the Friday. He was restrained over a period of an hour and a half by prison staff to remove a mobile phone. On the Friday, he was then assaulted by the other young people who were in on his unit on the Saturday. He had a fairly quiet day on the Sunday, and then he was released on bail on the Monday, which is just ridiculous. And there are examples of those very short periods of time spent on remand in our system that are just they sort of beg a belief in my own opinion. Now, the other issue that we have with children in custody is that they are vulnerable because they're in custody. They're vulnerable because custodial institutions that hold children are often quite chaotic. They're often unpredictable, or they certainly are so in England and Wales. And so, as part of an inspection, we run a survey of children at each institution that we visit, and about 4 out of 10 of them in YOIs say that they felt scared. About 2 out of 10 of them in STCs feel that they feel scared at the time. While they've been at that institution. And I think there's something sort of fairly fundamental about that. That if you are feeling frightened about your own safety, you're unlikely to address anything else. You're just going to deal with that fear of either attack or mistreatment or whatever wherever that sort of that instinct comes from, and that figure is high. We've been doing the same questions, give or take, for about 10 years, and that's the highest figure we've had, bar one, which was last year, for feelings of vulnerability while in custody. And the reason they feel vulnerable, put bluntly, is that violence, use of force, and self-harm are all going up within the system. So while our numbers are coming down, the outcomes for those that are held are not improving. And so they are vulnerable because of the fear and the environment that they live in. They're also vulnerable, I think, because, or particularly vulnerable because they lack credibility. And I think there's something slightly perverse in society that as you become more vulnerable, your word is taken less seriously. So people in prison, whether they're children or adults, when they complain, when they ask for things, they do it from, quite frankly, a cell that might be clean, or it might not be. There's generally a toilet in the corner. They're generally wearing ill-fitting clothes. They're less credible than I am speaking on this platform to you today. And so, the systems that are designed to protect them often treat them as such. And I think that is a fundamental vulnerability of being in custody. It's not a vulnerability that's unique to children, but because children, by and large, don't like to complain, we know that children in England and Wales in custody are 10 times less likely to complain than their adult counterparts. I think that we should take their complaints more seriously than we do currently. And finally, I'd like to reflect on the fact that custody makes people vulnerable because it necessarily isolates them. It isolates them from where they came from. It isolates them from their family, if they had one before they came into custody. And it isolates them from existing support networks that they had in the community, be that through social services or through any other support group or NGO that was dealing with them at their time of incarceration. And actually, of all the statistics that I could quote to you today, the one that concerns me most is that in YOIs, nearly a quarter of children in custody tell me that they don't have anyone to turn to if they have a problem. That's 1 in 4 at the time of the inspection. And that is despite the fact that we spend literally hundreds of thousands of pounds per place on people for them to talk to. And we have independent advocates coming out of our ears, we have psychologists, we have medical professionals, and we have people working with them on a day-to-day basis. And I think that the issue here is, I'll rephrase this slightly. When we asked them who they would turn to with a problem, if they had a problem, something slightly surprising, well, initially surprising to me, cropped up, is who they would turn to if they had a problem are the residential officers that work on their unit, who would be care staff in a social care setting, or they would be disciplined staff in a prison, and they are disciplined staff for sure in these institutions. And I think that shows where some of the solution to these issues are. It isn't, I think, in England and Wales, the creation of more posts that don't work directly with the children, that work on a sort of episodic basis. It's actually an improvement and an upskilling of those roles that work directly with the children, so that you can create the sort of trauma-informed models that we've heard about today. I don't think that can be done without focusing primarily on those that spend the most time with the children in custody. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angus. Our last, but certainly not least, of the speakers today is Ellen Maloney, who will give a personal testimony. Ellen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. When I was 4 years old, I wrote a letter to my nursery school complaining that they didn't teach me anything about medicine. I had decided that I wanted to be a doctor, and as far as I was concerned, my time was being wasted playing in sand and drawing pictures all day. When I was 12 years old, I stopped eating. I was under a lot of pressure at school, and it felt like the world was moving too fast for me, and I needed time to think. If I could press a pause button, I could slow things down. When I first stopped eating, time seemed to stop, and everything would go quiet. It wasn't long before I was first admitted to a hospital. First, it was somewhere near to where I lived, but then it was somewhere an hour's drive away, then somewhere 4 hours away. I missed my family, I missed my friends, but most of all, I missed school. It seemed like my future was being taken away from me. I was 13 when I first tried to kill myself. I spent 3 years moving around different hospitals, sometimes hundreds of miles away from home. Then, just after I turned 15, the doctors in charge of my care decided that the immediate risk to my life was too high for me to be kept in hospital, and I was placed in one of Scotland's secure children's homes. The unit I was in was not a facility that was equipped to deal with a young person with mental health problems. It operated on a strict behavioural regime, and so the only tools they had for keeping me safe were harsh and punitive. From the strip searches to the endless nights listening to other young people scream as they were restrained in their bedrooms, to spending days locked in my room with nothing but a mattress because I had cut myself, I kept asking myself what I had done that was so wrong to deserve being treated like this. This was no place to put vulnerable young people. The process of dehumanization began the moment we were brought into the unit. For me, it began with being taken into a small interview room and being told that I needed to take all my clothes off and wrap a towel around me to be searched. Then I was taken to my room and locked inside while I waited for someone to come back and search my bags. I waited and waited. It got later and later. I heard other young people shouting and screaming. I was terrified, and I was completely alone. Nobody was coming to help me. Nobody was coming to see if I was okay, and nobody was coming to tell me that this had been a horrible mistake. I listened to the screams coming down the hall late into the night, and I had no idea what was happening. I've never been as scared as I was that night. I stayed awake all night, curled up against the wall, just hoping that nobody would come and make me scream like that. It's been 20 years, and still as I climb into bed every night, I can hear that screaming as I stay curled up against the wall. Nothing has been the same for me since that first night. We were told by the staff all the time that we had put ourselves in the unit, that we were there because we were just bad kids. This was, of course, a damaging lie, but when you're told something often enough, you start to believe it. We had all had experiences that had impacted upon our mental health, and we all needed help. Most of my energy was spent focused on surviving within those walls, rather than on doing the work I needed to do for things to be different when I left. I was told constantly that I had chosen to put myself in this situation and chosen to let other people take control of my life, as if I could have made some other choice. The word choice implies that I had options, but the mental health problems I was struggling with meant I couldn't see options. To tell me that I had chosen this, and by implication was responsible and to blame for the situation I was in, was neither helpful nor true. I was completely powerless during those months. I was punished for being unwell, punished for minor mistakes, punished for being a normal teenager, punished by staff who were over-controlling because the environment enabled them to exert control just to prove to the young people that they were in charge. If there was a sign that a situation might escalate, like someone raising their voice, staff would lock that young person in their room until they had calmed down. When I look back, I can see how toxic an environment this was for all of us. Children need to be allowed to be children. Then there were other situations. For example, when I cut myself, Staff would respond with excessive force that created a situation that was traumatic for everyone involved. I can see now that the staff also felt powerless much of the time, but this frequently came across as frustration and anger. This is not a zero-sum game. Staff and young people both need to be empowered so that emotionally charged situations are opportunities for working together, rather than the combative us v them relationships that add fuel to the fire. Being treated constantly as if I had done something terribly wrong has left me with this sense that everyone else sees something inside of me that I don't see, that they know something about me that I don't know. I've been left doubting myself, unable to trust myself, hating myself. I question my own thoughts and opinions because so often I was told that how I was feeling was wrong, that how I was thinking was wrong, as if I, as a person, was wrong. I was told so often that I was fundamentally a bad person and treated as such, that I came to believe that everything I thought must be bad too, that what I think is less valid than what anyone else thinks. I find it hard to believe that my ideas and opinions are worth exploring, are worth sharing, are worth giving voice to. I feel inferior to other people, as if I'm a second-class citizen, someone that probably should be locked away. I feel like I have this dark secret that I carry with me, but I don't quite know what it is. Other people saw it, and they locked me up because of it. It's been 20 years since I was in the secure unit, and I struggle with the after effects. Nightmares, panic attacks, flashbacks. There's parts of the city I live in that I don't go to because of the memories that they hold. I can't bring myself to even mention the unit's name. But more than that, I struggle to rid myself of the belief that I was there because I was just a bad person, that I was locked up because of something inside of me that was dark and horrible. It's difficult for me to justify taking up space I don't feel entitled to because for so long I believed what I was told and then internalized, that I need to be locked away, erased from society, silenced. I was seen as a problem and treated as a problem, and the fact that I was a person got forgotten. I was talked about, and I was talked to, and I was talked on behalf of, but my voice wasn't part of the conversation. I was deliberately silenced. What I wanted or needed didn't matter. This is important because it has a lasting impact. I'm in my 30s now, and I still struggle to believe that what I think matters, that what I need matters. Everyone has the right to stand within the center of their own story. When I think about myself at 15, I remember how desperate I felt. I remember racing thoughts, constant anxiety, feeling like the world was too big and too fast for me. I felt lost inside it. I needed to be heard. I needed reassurance, and I needed hope. I needed what all of you here today would want for your own children if they were in pain, someone who can ease that for them. I needed to be lifted out of the darkness I was in, not kicked further down inside of it. When we think about young people who are at immediate physical risk, we need to consider how best to keep them safe. But we need to think about how the actions we take will be interpreted by them and the long-term impact that will have. It's very easy to judge and condemn what we don't understand, but when young people express their pain in a way that frightens us, we still need to respond with empathy and kindness. Instead of care being something that is done to a person, it needs to be a collaborative process of listening and learning, acknowledgement and engagement, trust and cooperation. By building relationships and working together with young people, we can empower them to find their own ways forward. It's those relationships that ultimately are what have saved me. I'm in my 30s now, and I'm still very much in the process of putting my life back together. I've always dreamed of going to university, and this year I finally returned to formal education, having been made to leave school when I was taken into the secure unit 20 years ago. I'm learning that there's more to me than what's happened to me and what I've been through. I'm finding my voice. I'm finally creating a future for myself that I'm excited to explore. This is what every young person deserves the opportunity to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you. So powerful. I'd like to open the floor for discussion. Who would like to take the floor? Maybe no one can take the floor after that, indeed. But I see...
Margaret. It is actually a little bit hard to collect thoughts after that very moving presentation. Thank you very much for that. I guess I did want to turn back to the very first speaker, to Hugh. The brain injury research is interesting because for all the obvious reasons that you pointed out, but it's a little bit. It creates an interesting dilemma in some respects, in that a different sort of brain research about the ways that the adolescent brain develops without injuries, right? But just the length of time it takes to develop has been very convincing in a lot of jurisdictions to raise the age of juvenile court jurisdiction, to reduce the most serious sentences, including in some cases the use of the death penalty for juvenile offenses and life without possibility of release. And all that's been premised on the idea that adolescents are malleable, that they can change with the right interventions. And I just wonder about the topics that you've raised, which suggest the need for very, very different interventions because of very specific circumstances around these people. That is, how do we pursue both of these angles such that we don't fall into some sort of trap of saying, in fact, who we're talking about who is locked up are those who are the least capable of change because of the kinds of injuries they have. If you see where I'm going with this, I think I know the answer, but I think that's the sort of question that I was grappling with as you were presenting.
Thank you, Michael. Actually, it's a very important point because you wouldn't want to deny somebody an opportunity to change and change behaviour. What's happening at the moment is that people are being denied opportunities to change behaviour and therefore back in prison again with regularity. And I guess brain injury is a part of that because it's a difficulty in changing behaviour because you don't remember what you've been told and your impulse control is not under control. Neurorehabilitation works. It actually reduces the chances somebody's going to be violent, somebody can get into a job much more easily if you get neurorehabilitation. What that is working a different way. Working a different way that works with somebody around goals that they have. And you've just been hearing about working with care collaboratively with somebody is the way that you want to be working to increase the chances somebody will then be able to achieve their goals in their lives. I absolutely agree with you. There's a danger in kind of reducing things down to, well, therefore somebody can't change. It's about that no change can happen, just that you have to use a different approach. So the example I gave with the young man with the left-sided brain injury was that he's not going to be able to follow instructions, make pictograms. That's the thing. It's about creating an environment in which people can therefore have the reminders, have the systems around them. And these days there's so much wearable technology that we can be much better at supporting people in the community. We do not need to be using these punitive systems. I take your point.
Okay, thank you. Next, Kevin Byrne, and then I think I saw Leo from Crin, was it? No, who was it? Okay, so Kevin and then...
Thanks, Margaret. And I think thanks too for a day of kind of really inspiring testimonies and presentations generally. It wasn't so much a question, but just a comment that despite how inspiring the presentations have been, to some extent I'm leaving here depressed because, I mean, the basic message seems to be very clearly and strongly that detention doesn't work, not as a last resort, not for a short period of time. It doesn't work, full stop, for children. And furthermore,
it seems to me that what I'm hearing is that it actually puts the child further at risk. So, adopting a child rights approach, I worry that I'm actually sitting here colluding to find some sort of acceptable way that we can continue to lock up children and the way it will go. So, yeah, I don't know, sorry Ursula, but my vote for the €1 million would be to actually invest in guardianship and in legal representation. Because, again, coming away at the end of this evening, I just feel those are the two things that no child should be in detention without, independent counsel and a guardian in the best sense of the word. And we talked about guardianship last year, and, I think it's a model that really works. I think Nicolina has pointed out some of the difficulties about it. It's not a simple solution or anything at all like that. But I just think it's what every child actually has to have if they were in that situation. That would be my comment for the evening. And again, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. No collusion, I hope.
Hello, my name is Kristen Hope and I work with Tokenism Foundation. Thank you so much to all of the panelists and especially to Ellen for sharing that very moving testimony. I just wanted to ask or sort of raise what I feel is actually a tension. I maybe slightly disagree with the previous person from the floor who said that maybe there's this consensus that deprivation of liberty doesn't work. I feel that there is a kind of tension emerging on one hand about the need for care, maybe in some very, very specific context, but also about where that care takes place, and now whether that's in an institutional setting which deprives children of liberty or outside. So Professor Hugh, you just mentioned that it's about creating an environment, and you mentioned that there's more promising practices at community-based level. And I just was curious to ask some of the panelists if they're, to what extent is there an emerging evidence base around care in non-institutional settings for these, for mental health issues or for severe injuries such as those that the professor was speaking about, neurological injuries, whether this evidence is quantitative or if there's an emerging body of qualitative narratives, such as those like Ellen or by peers of hers which may have received care in a community-based setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. We have Zsolt, you asked for the floor from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee.
Thank you very much. Just a brief food for thought still for tonight, adding a bit to what Nicolina said about the situation of unaccompanied minors who are stranded in Serbia, resisting the obvious temptation to add a lot to that story from our side of that fence separating us at the moment. I'd just like to focus on one thing which you mentioned that I think is crucial, and I do think that everyone who works in the field with unaccompanied minors or children in particular, not just in a migratory context, would think the same, is that it's very important to earn the trust of the children that you work with, but especially with children in the migratory context, it is very hard to get to the core of that trust because of the many things that have been told to them by the people who are the first level of contact with a refugee or an asylum procedure or legal proceedings in Europe, or the smugglers, quite often, and listening to them may lead to catastrophic consequences for children. Just to bring up the example of Hungary, if children asking for asylum rely on advices given by smugglers and state that they are related to each other, it may cause a situation for someone to be arbitrarily detained of his or her liberty in an unlawful manner among inhuman conditions in the transit zone, whereas even the current stage of Hungarian law may provide that person doesn't have to stay in the transit zone for an indefinite period of time. And this first level of the work really has to be put a lot of effort to, and I just wanted to raise this point up again so that we may reiterate it during the course of the coming 2 days, since I think it's such an important topic to be explored. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Hugh, you would like to take the floor, and I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to add something, but Hugh, over to you.
Yes, in response to the previous question, in terms of evidence base, the evidence base from New Zealand, and it's my impression of it, but there's been a reduction in young people being sent into prison and or being given a criminal record in the last 2 years. Part of that's because of identification of neurodisabilities in children, and therefore providing more community-based restorative justice approaches. Aligned with that, a development of a youth or adolescent-orientated police system, so the police are more likely to engage with children in a way that de-escalates problematic situations and so on. I mentioned another programme developed in Wales through Welsh Justice Board on a formulation-based approach, which has had a reduction. A pilot project so far indicates, if you take account of adversity factors and also informed by looking at neurodisability, more a clinical psychology formulation as to what's going on in a young person's life. That then informs the way the offender managers work with the young person, and that also informs the way judges and magistrates work, because you have some kind of sense of narrative of the young person's life, which has reduced the number of children ending up in custody and also reduced crime. Both pretty good outcomes, I imagine, and that's now being piloted planned for piloting that in parts of England. And so there's an evidence base that's emerging, and there's also other forms of interventions that are helpful when kids are brought up to deal with adversity, which has also indicated a way for in England and Wales, the NHS is now more in charge of running healthcare for young offender units and prisons. And there's a drive to develop secure stairs, which is trauma, as you've heard a little bit from Angus, a trauma-informed approach. So to change over from having a system where young people are detained, but change it towards the therapeutic environment. And there are similar systems. There's a similar system in Spain and so on. So I think there's a body of evidence that would indicate that that's the way to go. And therefore you're reducing the chances. Unfortunately, one might be able to get that case across if you make the financial argument, not just the human rights and child rights argument, but aligned with the child rights and human rights angle. The economics would be reasonable to indicate that that's how you reduce the chances of crime in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I'd like to pass the floor to Ellen.
I've been working with the treatment team for the last 8 years, I think, who were set up because of a lack of inpatient beds, and they do everything that an inpatient team would do in the community. So they have psychiatrists, psychologists, support workers, and they come to your house as many times a day as you need, with the whole aim to kind of make a hospital in your home. And that's been what's kind of saved me from, I haven't been in hospital since I started working with them, and gradually it's now tapered down from having them like 20 hours a week to now I see a therapist just once a week from that team. And I don't think that would have been enough when I was 15, because by that point things were really out of control. But I think something like that when I was 12 would have really helped, and I think more needs to be done for early intervention and adequate psychiatric help for young people when they first present with symptoms and asking for help. I didn't see a therapist as an individual therapist until I was 17 or 18, which by then I'd been within the system for 6 or 7 years and in institutions that entire time. that doesn't make any sense to me. I'd been asking for help from the very beginning. So I think more kind of community-based approaches early on could be really effective.
Thank you, Ellen. And I think 20 years will stay in all our minds if you think of the impact. Would anybody else like to take the floor? Rachel?
Rachel Brett, Cope. Apart from, again, saying thank you so much to Ellen, I did actually have a question for Angus, because I'd be really interested to know whether you've also looked at the question of how many of those within your institutions are actually themselves parents.
We do ask the question. The caveat to the answer is it's self-reported data. So the YJB have some data on how many children who are in custody are themselves parents. We have the data. It's below 5%, but it's significant in terms of numbers. I don't have it immediately to hand, but I can give it you in the margins. But if anyone's interested in the survey or anything else we do, we publish it annually with comparators to previous years. And the demographic stuff's in there as well. But there is a significant number of under 18s who are parents. And actually, as you go up, the seriousness of their offending, you're actually more likely to be a parent in those cases.
Thank you very much, Angus. If nobody else would like to take the floor, Ursula has bravely volunteered to draw some concluding remarks from this afternoon. She's a brave woman. Ursula, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. So just as reflecting on the couple of sessions that we've had this afternoon, and people have already from the floor made their own, drawn their own conclusions about the importance of what we've heard. Reflecting on all of the presentations, what we've clearly heard is about the very serious impact of detention on children and young people, both directly and indirectly. The harms that it causes, the violence, the lack of support, failure to provide and invest in really individualised care, and the poor outcomes. We've also heard very important insights into practice and that reality of detention, coupled with insights also into some really important programmes and initiatives and how we can advance those in the days ahead. It's clear that when we talk about the impact of detention on young people, that from the presentations that we've seen the disproportionate and often discriminatory impact of detention on those young people who have particular vulnerability, whether it's disability, experience of trauma, poverty, minority status, or mental health problems. And that's clearly regardless of the reasons for detention in the first place, whether it's young people in conflict with the law or migration or some form of secure protective care. And so we've heard a lot about also the gaps between law and practice, including the gaps between the standards that are set out in the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the reality that the young people experience. I think also, though, what we've heard on a more positive note is the importance of research and the importance of data and evidence, whether that's addressing issues of health or the kind of supports that we need to put in place, or the experiences of young people, the importance of their views and their testimony. We've also heard, I think, about the importance of a children's rights approach, both in how we conceptualise these issues, but also how we support advocacy, whether we're drawing on the concluding observations of the committee, the Convention, the international standards, the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. All of that has been referenced. And we've also heard lots of reference to the reform that is ongoing right across Europe, and some references to the United States as well. So there are causes for being optimistic. as we reassert the importance of things like specialisation, the right to a lawyer, the importance of the rule of law, accountability in how we both use detention and the conditions of detention, an awareness of rights, the importance of a holistic response, the visibility of these issues, and critically, the importance of preventing and intervening early. I think, though, clearly the case against detention is very strong, as Kevin has said, and I suppose my point of view in advocating for the global study is that this is the kind of data we need to politically convince, both at a national and an international level, that we both must do better with how we treat young people in this context, but also to convince the law and policy makers to move towards elimination altogether. And so I believe, and I think that is borne out by previous global studies, that the kind of momentum that can build around a global study is really important. So we can maybe disagree on that point. I think finally the point I would finish on by way of a positive conclusion is that we have heard references to the themes of participation, starting with Laura's presentation earlier on, to the importance of family, the importance of support, early intervention, the importance of working together, of empowerment, of trust and of resilience. And I think those themes will carry us into the next couple of days as well. So thanks to everybody for all of their contributions, and particularly all of our panellists and to everybody from the floor.
I would just like to thank all the panellists also for these wonderful presentations, and of course for keeping to the time, which is important. Thank you all for your very active and concentrated attention this afternoon. And as you know, we ask you to take all this with you into the forum and to use it, as several people have reminded. Please take it with you. If I remember well, the buses leave at 6:45. Marta, is that right? 18:45, the bus is outside to take you back to the hotel. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you all. Have a good evening. We'll see you bright and early tomorrow morning. We have you up at the crack of dawn. Thank you.